Chapter 10:17. After reading the old mistress' letter, Li Yi called Xiao Huan over and asked her to show the letter to Rui and the others. The old mistress' letter was not written for him. She did not mention him as much as Rui. The next letter was very short. The handwriting was rather immature. Duanwu had only been learning to read for a few years, so it was already very good that she had made such progress. The little girl used a worried tone to talk about the heavy workload that caused her to have no time to play during this period of time. She also said that the guy called Li Han was always bothering her, which was very annoying. The only time she wasn't annoyed was when he was explaining the math problems to her. For the time being, there were only 3 letters. The last one was naturally Li Xian's. Li Yi opened the envelope. After glancing through it, he shook his head helplessly. Li Xian, this guy, had thrown all the matters of the court to Emingzu. He had gone off to study soap bubbles, leaving Emingzu, a princess, to worry about the empress. And he still had the cheek to ask himself why the bubbles under the sun were colorful. Li Yi looked at Yongning, who was blowing bubbles and soap water to tease Li Duan. Even Yongning knew that it was the interference of light. 2/3 of this guy's letter was actually about this, and based on this he proposed 3 conjectures and 5 hypotheses. He picked up his pen and wrote on the paper, "To understand why the soap bubbles under the sun are colorful, we must first understand the wave-particle duality of light. Speaking of the wave-particle duality of light, we must mention the theory of relativity. And before we understand the theory of relativity, we must definitely not bypass quantum theory." When he reached the angle between the direction of vibration of the incident light vector and the direction of polarization of the polarizer, Li Yi could not continue. He then used one sentence to explain the principle of the interference of light, which caused the soap bubbles under the sun to be colorful. He then used a few hundred words to briefly describe the recent events of the past month. He asked about the situation in the capital. He estimated that 5,000 words should be enough. He put a few pieces of paper into an envelope and sealed it. The courier would send it to the capital at the fastest speed of 800 li. He looked at Fang and asked, "Just these 3 letters? Is that all?" Fang shook his head and said, "Only these 3. Li Yi lowered his head and said after a long time, "So be it." Ever since he left the capital, he could only get bits and pieces of information about Emingzu and Shanning from Li Xian's letters. He thought they would write back, but after waiting for so long, there was still no letter. Even the letters he sent were not answered. He still remembered that the day before he left, Emingzu held his hand and asked him if he could stay. He also remembered that the girl ran out of the palace barefoot and cried her heart out. Thus, his anger towards certain people in the capital, which he had managed to quell with great difficulty, rose again. Li Duan watched for a while and didn't want to watch any more. He trotted over, held Li Yi's arm and asked, "Father, Duaner, Mrs. Xiao Rui and Xiaonyang, when are we going back to the capital?" At the age of 2, Li Duan could already speak his mind in complete sentences. "In a few more days. In a few more days I will be able to see Xiao Rui." Li Yi picked him up and suppressed the anger in his heart. He asked with a smile, "Isn't Xiaonyang at home? Why does Duaner still miss Xiaonyang?" He only thought that Xiaonyang was what Li Duan called Ruoqing or Zuemo. Perhaps Rui taught him to call her that these days. "Xiaonyang is not at home. Xiaonyang is in the capital." Li Duan shook his head and said, "Xiaonyang will give Duaner candy figurines to eat." The smile on Li Yi's face froze in an instant. Zuemo and Ruoqing would not give him candy figurines to eat. The child was still young and eating too much candy was not good for his teeth. He gently put Li Duan down and picked up the letter sent by Li Xian. The letter said that there was a girl who stood on the palace wall every day and looked in the direction of Shuzhou. Every letter he sent would mention this sentence. The letter also said that she would read every letter he sent without missing a word. She was the person who would secretly give Li Duan candy figurines to eat. He lowered his head, touched Li Duan's head and said, "I also want to. When you grow up I will take you back to see her." Li Duan nodded and said, "Then Duaner should eat well and grow up quickly. When you grow up you will be able to see Xiaonyang." Li Yi's face was a little dazed. There was once a girl who told him that she would eat well, sleep well and do her homework well. She would grow up well and wait for him to come back. What the girl didn't know was that when she said these words she had already grown up. A bunch of bastards. Thinking of the faces of those people in the capital again, thinking of the girl standing opposite him and smiling with tears in her eyes, Li Yi's face darkened and his fists clenched. When Qin Chong saw Li Yi, he knew that someone was going to be in trouble. He stood up from his seat and asked, "What happened?" Li Yi's face darkened. "Write a memorial and hand it in." Say that suppressing bandits in Shuzhou has cost a lot of money and suffered heavy losses. Ask the court to allocate 1,000,000 taels of silver. Qin Chong froze and then looked at him in disbelief. 1,000,000 taels of silver? You're crazy. They won't agree. Li Yi looked at him and asked, either they agree to allocate the money or Shuzhou doesn't pay taxes for 50 years. Which do you think they will choose? Qin Chong didn't need to guess to know which option the people in the capital would choose. Shuzhou had always been poor and full of bandits. Not mentioning paying taxes to the court every year, it could already be considered a good year if it didn't rely on the court's aid and not drag the court down. 1,000,000 taels of silver or non-existent taxes. Even an idiot would know which to choose. The court was full of smart people, so they would definitely choose the second option. The result of choosing this path was that they would be ridiculed by their descendants for 50 years, because the Shuzhou of today was no longer the Shuzhou of yesterday. The Shuzhou of tomorrow was no longer the Shuzhou of today. In the entire world, no one dared to make such a request to the court, but unfortunately the person before him was one of them. The court had to choose one of the two options he gave. Once they made a choice, they had to abide by it. As long as he was alive, he could not go back on his word. The capital, Hibiscus Garden. Li Xian sat by the lake, comfortably lying on a rocking chair. He gazed at the soap bubbles floating in the air, changing colors under the sunlight. A eunuch stood behind him, blowing soap bubbles with great effort. Because he had been blowing for too long, his face was pale, his entire body was dizzy, and he wanted to vomit. Another eunuch ran over from a distance. When he was still several dozen zhang away, he shouted, Your Majesty, Jianghu of Silla has replied, Jianghu of Silla has replied. He has replied. Li Xian bounced up from the rocking chair, his face lit up with joy, and he strode over. The eunuch who was blowing bubbles felt as if he had been pardoned. He leaned against a tree behind him, breathing in big mouthfuls of fresh air. Li Xian snatched the letter from the eunuch's hand and tore it open carefully. Then he sat back on the rocking chair and started reading. Wave-particle duality of light, general theory of relativity, quantum theory, Schrödinger's cat, Murphy's law, L'Hospital's law. Li Xian stood up from the rocking chair, a thoughtful look on his face. He took the letter back to his room, took out a pen and paper, and started writing and calculating. Sometimes he bit the tip of the pen, his brows furrowed, and sometimes he laughed out loud, slamming the table as if he had gone mad. Chapter 10:18. The eunuchs and palace maids were used to His Majesty's crazy behavior. Whenever His Majesty was thinking seriously, he would act like this. Compared to other things that His Majesty had done, this was nothing. A month ago, His Majesty gathered all the officials and nobles in front of the political hall. He sent 2 eunuchs to the top of the golden hall to throw down 2 iron balls, one big and one small from the same height. The iron balls fell to the ground at the same time under the witness of countless officials and nobles. The Academy of Science proposed the concept of free fall and calculated the value of gravitational acceleration considering air resistance. It was said that many of the Academy of Science's research was based on this concept. They didn't know what gravitational acceleration was, but after this experiment spread throughout the capital, 3 scholars went crazy within a few days. Since then, no one dared to question the Academy of Science anymore. It was said that His Majesty discovered this phenomenon when he was inspired by a strange woman in his early years. It was because of that woman that His Majesty embarked on the path of studying the laws of heaven and earth. To commemorate that strange woman, His Majesty named this experiment Xiao Huan Free Fall Experiment. Since then, the 5th of November every year has been designated as Science and Technology Day in the Jing Kingdom. Later generations also had high praise for this experiment. It was hailed as the first of the 10 most beautiful physics experiments in the Jing Kingdom. This experiment broke the rigid way of thinking, inspired people's wisdom, and had a profound impact on future generations. Of course, this was all in the future. Note, that's right, I copied the book review again. Thanks to Chidian reader Springwood 11 for your imagination. 2 hours later. Li Xian rubbed his slightly swollen head. His face was slightly pale. He finally saw the key point. The color of soap bubbles is caused by the superposition of light reflected from the front and back membranes. It's a phenomenon of light interference. He was startled. If the answer to the question was this simple, then the things he had read earlier such as wave-particle duality, general relativity, quantum theory, Schrödinger's cat, Murphy's law, L'Hospital's law, all of these things that he had struggled so hard to understand, were all used by Li Yi to make up for the number of words in the book? Schrödinger's cat. What was the relationship between Schrödinger and old General Shui? He knew that the box might be poisoned, yet he still put the cat in. Did he ever consider the cat's feelings? Who was Murphy? Was he the descendant of the Mo family? The laws he proposed had nothing to do with the ideology of the Mo family. Who was Luobita? What was the limit? Why did he ask for guidance? If he ran fast enough, his sorrow would not be able to catch up with him. Was this the theory of relativity? But what did this have to do with his question? After staring blankly on the spot for a long time, his face finally revealed an embarrassed and angry expression. He sat back down and picked up the letter. A moment later, he suddenly slapped the table and said angrily, "This deranged fellow, he actually gathered 4,381 words this time." A figure walked in from outside and looked at Li Xian, asking in a low voice, "Imperial brother, did teacher send a letter?" Li Xian looked at the girl who was quietly standing in front of him with a smile. A trace of heartache flashed across his face as he smiled and said, "Yes, he said that Dwayner misses you very much and wants to come back to see you as soon as he grows up." The girl said with a smile, "I also miss Dwayner. I wonder if he has grown taller and how many teeth he has grown. I didn't say in this letter." Li Xian took out another letter from the table and handed it to her. He said, "This is a letter from him to you. Maybe it's written on it. Oh yes, there's also a letter from your imperial sister. When you return to the palace later, send it to her." "Thank you, Brother Xian." She took the letter. At this moment, a small figure ran in from outside. When she ran past the door, she accidentally tripped and fell. Without waiting for the eunuchs and palace maids to help her up, she got up by herself, patted the dirt off her body and ran to Li Xian. She raised her little face and asked, Daddy, is Dwayner back?" Li Xian picked her up and said, "Dwayner hasn't come back yet. When Xiao Rui grows up, Dwayner can come back to play with you." The little girl who had just turned 2 bit her finger and said seriously, "Then Xiao Rui has to grow up quickly?" Somewhere in the palace, the little girl carefully opened the letter with a faint smile on her face. She murmured, "Dwayner already has 20 teeth. His height?" She stood up and gestured. She murmured, "His height is already up to my waist. When he grows up, I won't be able to carry him." She carefully read the letter several times before putting it into an envelope and locking it in an exquisite box. There were already several letters lying in the box. 1 letter every month. There were a total of 8 letters now. In other words, her teacher had been gone for a full 8 months. When she received her teacher's first letter, her heart was filled with joy. She was so happy that she couldn't sleep for a few days. Later she wrote many pages of replies. Her wrists were sore. She had so many things she wanted to say to her teacher. She wanted to drink the soup that her teacher made. She wanted to eat the sugar figurines that her teacher bought for her. She wanted her teacher to put her on his neck to watch the fun. Later, she burned the letters one by one. No amount of paper could finish writing all the things she wanted to say to her teacher. She believed that her teacher knew all the things she wanted to say. "I wonder what was written in the letter that he wrote to my sister?" She looked at the other letter on the table and picked it up. She walked out of the palace and headed in the direction of the Morning Dew Palace. The Morning Dew Palace. The princess, who had just finished practicing, changed her clothes and bathed, walked back into the palace. She looked at an old man standing in the middle of the palace and asked, "1 year is almost up. What plans does Chief Chang have?" Changda raised his head and said, "There isn't much to see in the capital anymore. I plan to go take a look outside." This was once His Majesty's long-cherished wish. Now, I can only fulfill it on His Majesty's behalf. Emingzu nodded and didn't say anything else. Changda turned and walked out of the palace. After taking 1 step, he took another step back and asked, "I'll ask out of line. What plans does your highness have in the future?" Chief Chang. Princess Shaning walked in from outside and nodded slightly at Changda. She then handed the letter to Emingzu and said with a smile, "Sister, sir has sent a letter." Emingzu took the letter and then thought of Changda's question. However, when she raised her head to look, there was no one at the palace door. She put the letter away and asked the young girl beside her, "You have to manage the academy and the women's union. If you feel tired, you can put one down first." "I'm not tired." The young girl shook her head and said, "It's good to be busy every day. I can also learn many things that can't be learned from books. Sister, on the other hand, don't be too busy. Sir told me to keep an eye on you and not let you always stay up late. He said that girls who stay up late will age." Emingzu nodded. Every time he wrote to her, he would mention this. He said that girls who stayed up late would age easily and get wrinkles easily. It was easy for their hormones to go haywire, causing irregular menstruation and causing their breasts to shrink. He also said that if she became an old woman in the future, no one would want her. Therefore she never opened Li Yi's letters in front of Shanning. Little girls were not allowed to read them. After he left, she became more and more unscrupulous. However, Shuzhou was thousands of miles away from the capital. Her hands could not reach there. She thought about it, sat down, took a pen and paper and began to write. The young girl walked to the side and asked curiously, "Sister, are you going to reply to Sir?" Emingzi shook her head and said, "This is for your sister Rui." In the Shangshu province, an official slammed the memorial sent by the Shuzhou provincial governor on the table and said angrily, "What an exorbitant demand! 1,000,000 taels of silver. 1,000,000 taels of silver is enough to fight several wars with the Qi kingdom. Why do they need so much money to suppress bandits? Do they think the money in the national treasury comes out of thin air? Such an unreasonable request must not be agreed to." Chapter 10:19. The official was referring to a memorial that Qin Chong, the provincial governor of Shuzhou, had just sent over. Everyone was familiar with the name Qin Chong. The Qin clan was once illustrious for a time. Qin Qing was one of the pillars of the imperial court, and Qin Chong's name was known by everyone in the imperial court. Of course, that was the Qin family in the past. Later, the king of Shu lost power and was implicated by the Cui family. The Qin family soon declined. Qin Chong was stripped of his official position and his property was confiscated. He was reduced to opening a cloth shop in the capital to make a living. For a long time, this matter was a topic of discussion among the officials in the imperial court. He thought that the Qin family would never have a chance to rise again in this life, but he didn't expect that in just a year, the Qin family would become the provincial governor of Shuzhou. Shuzhou was the fief of the Jianghu of Silla and the most special prince of the Jing kingdom. The imperial court could not interfere with the appointment of the provincial governor of Shuzhou, nor could they criticize him. They accused him of something else. According to the memorial, after the Jianghu of Silla arrived in Shuzhou, he launched a vigorous campaign to suppress bandits. All the officials knew that there were many bandits in Shuzhou. For many years the imperial court and local officials tried to suppress them, but to no avail. As time went by, he took a laissez-faire attitude towards this matter. They did not care whether the Jianghu of Silla suppressed the bandits or not. The problem was that if he wanted to suppress bandits, it was just to suppress bandits. Why did he make it seem like he was at war with the Qi kingdom, the Wu kingdom, and the Zhao kingdom at the same time? Although the national treasury had not been so tight for the past 2 years, they could not be so extravagant. This was clearly blackmail. Someone looked up at the indignant official and asked, "Then, Lord Qi, do you think that we should choose the second option? Shuzhou does not pay taxes for 50 years? Although the Shuzhou is the fief of the Jianghu of Silla, it is also the land of the Jing kingdom. How can we do this?" Lord Qi waved his hand and said, "We will not choose either of these two options. You can tell this to His Highness the Jianghu of Silla and His Majesty." The official shook his head and said no more. His Highness the Jianghu of Silla was more favored by His Majesty than the Empress. If this memorial was sent directly to His Majesty, he would probably approve it immediately. Back then they were the ones who had forced King Jing to Shuzhou. Now, if they dared to add insult to injury, even if King Jing was far away in Shuzhou and could not do anything to them, His Majesty would not let them off easily. Because of the departure of the Jianghu of Silla, the conflict between them and His Majesty had not been completely resolved. Moreover, this matter was not that difficult to choose. Shuzhou had always been a sore point for the imperial court. Could be said that they did not care about it. It was indeed the territory of the Jing kingdom. But if they did care about it, that place was too chaotic. The imperial court could not reach that far. Its existence was of little value. It would only drag the imperial court down and pull down the per capita GDP of the country. All the data from the Ministry of Revenue could prove this point. It was tasteless, but it was a pity to throw it away. Therefore, when His Majesty conferred Shuzhou to the Jianghu of Silla, there was almost no opposition in the imperial court. Even if the Shuzhou did not pay taxes for 50 years, it would not affect the overall situation. That place was so chaotic. It was the Wu kingdom, the Qi kingdom, and the land of chaos. It was not easy to throw the blame to the Jianghu of Silla, but no one was willing to pick it up again. The two prime ministers were not present, so the ministers had a discussion and finally made a decision. They would submit this memorial to His Majesty and the princess. Li Xian had already gotten rid of the low-level interest of blowing soap bubbles. He held a prism and fiddled with it under the sun. The 2-year-old girl stood beside him and looked at it without blinking. She murmured, "Why hasn't Daddy conjured a rainbow yet?" Uncle Li conjured one so quickly, the little girl clapped her hands happily and ran over to show off to her mother. She was so happy that she finally managed to achieve the dispersion phenomenon. Mother, Daddy conjured a rainbow for Xiao Rui just now. After a while, Wang Qin walked over with the little girl in her arms. Li Xian looked at her and said, "That guy is going to get married soon and he's going to marry two at once? Isn't His Majesty going to get married soon? What's there to be envious about? Are you envious that the Jianghu of Silla can marry too?" Wang Qin looked at him and said, "If His Majesty is willing, he can marry more than the Jianghu of Silla. In addition to the imperial concubines, he can also have a few more concubines. What are you saying? Am I as fickle and beastly as him?" Li Xian said righteously as he held the mother and daughter in his arms. Wang Qin blushed slightly and gently pinched him. "You're already an emperor, but you're still not serious. Xiao Rui is still here." The little girl covered her eyes and quickly said, "Xiao Rui can't see anything, she can't see anything." The family of three laughed and played for a while. Then Wang Qin took the little girl to sleep. Li Xian walked back to the hall and opened the memorial at the top. He only glanced at it and used a red brush to circle the words, "Shuzhou will not pay taxes for 50 years. He sighed and said, "I really want to see with my own eyes what you can make Shuzhou look like." The reason he chose this option was not because he was reluctant to part with silver, but because he knew that a mere 1,000,000 taels of silver could not compare to the Shuzhou that he governed. Because if he didn't check the second option, he wouldn't receive any reply next month. More importantly, according to his description, Shuzhou was a good place. It sounded like it was a lot more fun than the capital. Shuzhou, the provincial governor's residence. Chen Chong looked at the imperial edict that Li Yi had delivered and felt his lips go dry. His Majesty had actually agreed. He had agreed to allow Shuzhou to develop freely for these 50 years and not have to pay taxes to the court. This was an imperial edict. The emperor did not joke about it, and there was no such thing as a trifling edict. The officials in court would no longer have the chance to regret it. When it came to Shuzhou, if they wanted to throw it away, they could throw it away. However, Shuzhou was not a place that they could throw away or pick up as they pleased. After today, they could only look at the rich and populous Shuzhou with envy. After following at Li Yi's side for so long, he now seemed to understand why Li Yi had never been willing to enter the court when he was in the capital. Because the people in the court were basically a bunch of pigs. One could imagine what would have happened if the court had not interfered for so many years and allowed Shuzhou to develop freely. The reason he was able to sit step by step in the position of censor was not because of the Qin family. Thus, he could clearly see that in less than 50 years, Shuzhou would become even more prosperous than Qing and Fu and Jingdou. At that time, would they still feel heartache over the 1,000,000 taels of silver? Jianghu of Silla Fu. Li looked at Fang and asked, "Other than the imperial edict, is there anything else?" Fang nodded and said, "There is also a letter." Li casually asked, "From Li Xian?" Fang shook his head and said, "From the princess." Li was stunned and asked in disbelief, "Which princess?" "The eldest princess." "Ah." Li suddenly stood up from his seat. "Why didn't you say so earlier that the eldest princess sent a letter? Quick, show it to me." Fang took a step back and shook his head. He said, "The eldest princess did send a letter, but it was not for the son-in-law." Li was stunned on the spot. If the eldest princess's letter was not for him, who else could it be for? To Yongning, to Rui? It couldn't be for Mississippi Lu, could it? Fang looked at him and explained, "This letter was written by the eldest princess to the second young mistress." "What? Emingzu gave it to Rui?" Li was stunned again. Emingzu and Rui, their relationship didn't seem to be so good that they would write letters to each other, right? Besides, he had written so many letters to her, but she didn't reply to any of them. She actually took the initiative to write to Mississippi Lu. This didn't make sense, nor did it make sense. Li shook his head and said, "I don't believe it. Let me have a look." Fang took out the letter from his sleeve and put it on the table. "I told you to read more." Li looked at the letter and looked at him with disappointment. He pointed at the words on the envelope and said, "Look, it clearly says for Li Yi. Why is it written for Rui? Although you can't read, you can't talk nonsense." Fang looked a little sad and said, "Son-in-law, you are insulting me. Although I can't read, I know how to count. For Li is 4 words, for Lu Rui is 5 words." He shook his head and continued, "And I asked the courier. This letter is indeed for the second young mistress. Son-in-law, don't lie to me and don't lie to yourself." Li finally understood why Fang's martial arts had stagnated. He was ignorant and incompetent. He was simply ignorant and incompetent. He didn't practice but secretly learned. He obviously didn't know how to count before. Chapter 10:20. Even if she wrote it to Rui, can't I read it? Li took the envelope from his hand and said, "What is my relationship with Emingzu and Rui? The three of us are like one person. Is it wrong for me to read the letter I wrote to myself?" Fang looked at him and said seriously, "Young master, I advise you not to read it." Li tore the envelope in front of him and took out the letter. Fang looked at him and did not say anything. He just patted him on the shoulder, sighed and turned to leave. "You're getting more and more insensible." Li glanced at him. He took Mingzhu's letter and planned to go back to his room to read it. However, he did not go back. He stood there for a long time and wiped the sweat on his forehead. He opened the letter and handed it to Mississippi Lu and said, "This is a letter from Emingzu to you. I opened it for you." Fang was insensible. He did not know Rui when he saw her, so he opened the letter and handed it to her. After Li handed the letter to Mississippi Lu, he asked thoughtfully, "Do you want me to read it for you?" Mississippi Lu said indifferently, "Read it if you want." "That's embarrassing." Li looked at the letter in her hand. Mississippi Lu turned and went back into the house. Li looked at her back and sighed and shook his head. Saying one thing and going back on one's words, "Oh, women." Li leaned against the pillar and was puzzled. Emingzu did not reply to him. What kind of letter did she write to Rui? Changda and old Taoist Yuan were both gurus, and they were close to each other. In terms of distance and strength, there was no reason for them to ask Mississippi Lu for guidance. It could be said that they were confiding in each other's bosom friends, but they were not bosom friends. They would fight whenever they saw each other. It was impossible for them to chat about their daily lives. Emingzu would never compare who was older with Mississippi Lu in the letter. That would be asking for humiliation. What did they have to say in the letter? Li really couldn't understand. No matter how he thought about it, it was all Fang's fault. In the past he was such a simple, kind and qualified wingman. Ever since he got together with Little Red, he had completely changed. Emingzu had written a letter to Rui, but she hadn't told him in advance. What if they? What would he do? There was no way he could explain this to Rui, let alone the old emperor. Soon Rui came out of the room. Li pretended to ask casually, "What did she say in the letter?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him and said lightly, "The letter is on the table in the room. If you want to read it, go and read it yourself." "I don't want to read it." Li shook his head and walked into her room. He said, "The letter you borrowed from me last time? Bah, it's time to return the book you borrowed from me. I'll go and get it myself." The letter was indeed on her desk. When Li walked over, he glanced at it. There were only 2 lines of words. It didn't look like a letter at all. He took a book from the bookshelf. When he walked over, he stopped and finally saw the 2 lines clearly. "He teased me." That was the first line. "Help me beat him up, I'll help you next time." This was the second line. Li looked at Mississippi Lu, who was standing at the door, and curled his lips. It was fine if she didn't want him to read it, but why did she have to take out a fake letter? She must have written it herself. Emingzu was the princess of a country, and there was no distinction between them. How could she say something like that? What's more, he wrote this letter just to get Rui to beat him up. What's this, Didi call? A clumsy self-directed performance. This Rui was getting more and more out of hand. "Ha, women." Then he saw the woman begin to close the door. Li's expression changed and he immediately said, "You don't really believe what she said, do you?" Mississippi Lu didn't say anything and walked straight towards him. Li retreated to the bedside and said, "We are a family. Emingzu is still an outsider for the time being. Are you sure you want to listen to her one-sided words?" Mississippi Lu looked at him and said, "You just said that the 3 of us are like one person and I beat myself up. Is that wrong?" Li thought for a moment and said, "I was wrong. You used a wrong conclusion and you can only come up with an even more wrong conclusion. I'm not you, so beating me up is not the same as beating yourself up." Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "Then what is the correct conclusion?" "You are you, the unique you. Emingzu and I are like one person. If she wants to beat me up, I have nothing to say." Mississippi Lu thought for a moment, looked at him and said, "You and Emingzu are like one person and Li Emingzu and I are also like one person, so you and I are also like one person." Li's eyes widened. "How can you 2 be like one person?" Mississippi Lu looked at him and said, "I have taken a bath with her." "Have you?" "I have even slept with her." "Have you?" Li looked at her and said disdainfully. Li remembered that once in the morning dew hall, the 2 of them were discussing national affairs, and then Emingzu was so sleepy that she fell asleep on his shoulder. He was never afraid of who was closer to Emingzu. She had seen Emingzu take a bath, and he had seen her take a bath. Mississippi Lu was stunned, then looked at him and murmured, "You have slept together." When Li Yi walked out of Mississippi Lu's room, Fang was squatting in the yard watching him walk out. Hitting is a sign of affection and scolding is love. Fang looked at him and said, "The harder you hit, the deeper the love. You should be content, son-in-law. You should know that second miss never treats others like that." Fang was not only ignorant and incompetent, but also shamelessly plagiarized. The shameless Fang looked at Li Yi and said, "Son-in-law, sit." "I'm not sitting." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I've been sitting in Rui's room for too long." Fang looked at him and didn't expose him. He thought for a moment and asked, "Son-in-law, it will be New Year in 2 days and the 15th is coming soon. Should we prepare?" "A few days earlier. Don't ruin the Lantern Festival." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "The 11th day of the first month is a good day. Tell them to attack on the 11th. Fang thought for a moment and asked, "Then should we tell Qin Chong to mobilize some troops from other places?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "No need. The garrison of Yong County is the same as before. They won't be needed this time." It had to be said that the holy religion couldn't be underestimated. Their followers were all hidden in the dark. Other than those people, there were even more hidden spies. From the information obtained so far, they should have already infiltrated the defense of Yong County. If they mobilized the garrison of Shuzhou, they definitely wouldn't be able to cover up all the movements and would definitely alert the enemy. When the king of Shu escaped, it would be difficult to catch him again. "Alright, I'll arrange it right away." Fang responded and turned to leave. After Fang left, Li Yi rubbed his buttocks and an extremely depressed expression appeared on his face. Emingzu and Rui were actually in cahoots, writing a letter to Rui from thousands of miles away just to beat him up. More importantly, Rui actually believed her one-sided words and sided with her. Beating them up was a sign of affection and scolding them was a sign of love. Sooner or later, he would settle the scores with those two women and let them know how much he loved them. A love that couldn't be expressed in words. Chapter 10:21. As the new year approached, the people of Yong County finally knew what was going on with the newly built shopping mall at the West Gate. Shops, they were all shops. They were too much for one's eyes to take in and they lingered on for a long time. There were restaurants, brothels, inns, cloth stores, clothing stores, music stores, jewelry stores. There was even a market that occupied 5 shops. From now on, they didn't need to travel all over the county just to buy a few things. In this small shopping mall, there was nothing they couldn't think of. In the past, the people living near the West Gate were the poorest people in Yong County. In the past few months, the situation had changed dramatically. Businessmen from all over could no longer rent shops in the shopping mall. Yong County temporarily prohibited foreign businessmen from buying and selling land, so they could only pay high rents to the surrounding people and rent their houses as shops. They immediately became the wealthiest group of people in the county. These people weren't the only ones whose lives had changed. The textile workshops had also provided many ways for the idle women at home to earn money. They could choose to weave at home and sell to the textile workshop, or they could work in the textile workshop for a fixed monthly salary. They could also raise silkworms and sell the silk. The fabrics and clothing of the Jing Kingdom, especially silk, were very popular in all countries. No matter how many goods they produced, they didn't have to worry about not being able to sell them. The tradition of men farming and women weaving didn't change, but the delicate women used their skillful hands to support half of the sky at home. Later research showed that in Yong County, the famous hometown of silk in the Jing Kingdom, the tradition of men living off women and being afraid of their wives originated from this. Although the standard of living had improved, the spending power of the people in Yong County was limited. They still had to rely on these businessmen from all over the country. Even though they had to pay taxes to the local government and the rent for the shops in the shopping mall wasn't cheap, it was still much better than taking the risk of traveling all over the mountains and rivers. Just 2 days after the opening, the shopping mall was already crowded with people. After all, it was stupid not to take advantage of a good deal. Many of the shops in Yong County had opening promotions and year-end clearance sales at the same time. If they missed this opportunity, they would have to wait until next year. 10 coins for all, 10 coins for all. You can't buy for 10 coins, you can't buy for 10 coins, you can't buy for 10 coins, you can't buy for 10 coins. The shopkeeper is in a hurry to go home for the new year. He's selling at a loss, selling at a loss. Last 2 days, last 2 days. The shopkeeper ran away with his sister-in-law. We can only use the Rui dew and perfume to pay for our wages. Everything is half price, everything is half price. Whenever a shop advertised like this, there would be an endless stream of customers, causing the surrounding peers to be dumbfounded. 10 copper coins half price loss. If everyone did business like this, then all the merchants in this world would have starved to death long ago. These businessmen from the Jing kingdom really had no bottom line. Was silver so important that he was willing to throw away his face for it? However, when they looked at the crowded shop and the few people in their shop, the expressions on the others' faces became complicated. Finally, a few of them whispered a few words into the ears of their shop assistants. The assistants hesitated for a moment before walking out of the shop. New store opening, second item half price. Buy 3 get 1 free, buy 5 get 2 free, buy 10 get 5 free. Opening discount. 10 coins will be deducted for every 100 coins. 50 coins will be deducted for every 300 coins. The crowd split into several groups and rushed towards the shops. Amidst the crowd, a man in blue walked out of the shopping mall. He looked back for a long time before turning around and exiting the city gate from another direction. Opposite the shopping mall, on the second floor of a tea house, another man in blue withdrew his gaze and stood up. He respectfully said to the young man opposite him, "Lord Su, this man is Zheng Bang, a blue-clothed messenger of the church. He works under the right emissary, in the land of Bedlam." A man in blue looked at Fang Yu and said, "Guardian, it has been confirmed. That place has indeed been turned into a market. I've seen it with my own eyes. The shops there are doing very well. If we attack from the west gate, we can first rob them of all their goods and money. It's very convenient." Fang Yu lowered his head and thought for a moment. He asked, "Is there any movement in the defense of Yong County?" The man in blue thought for a moment and said, "Nothing out of the ordinary. I've already contacted our spy. He said that there are no signs of movement in the defense of Yong County. If there is any news, he will inform us immediately." Fang Yu nodded and said, "On the 14th of the first month." "That's not appropriate." The king of Shu strode in from outside and said, "Baldy's men are here. They suggest that we attack a few days earlier, on the 11th of the first month. The 15th of the first month is the Lantern Festival. 3 days before that, the defense of the county will definitely be strengthened. It's most suitable to attack on the 11th of the first month. It can minimize the losses." Fang Yu thought for a moment and felt that what the king said made sense. Then he seemed to think of something and frowned. He said, "According to the almanac, it's forbidden to go out on the 11th of the first month." The king of Shu knew that the holy religion was troublesome, but he didn't expect it to be so troublesome. They already had the empress, so why would they still believe in the almanac? He frowned and asked, "Where is the almanac?" Fang Yu pointed to the table. The king of Shu walked over to take a look and picked it up. He smiled and said, "This is this year's. In a few days it'll be next year. This almanac is outdated. It'll be the 11th of the first month." He looked at Fang Yu and said, "I'll send someone to inform those baldies. They'll start preparing now and strive to be foolproof." Fang Yu was silent for a moment and nodded. "All right." The two discussed for a while more before the king of Shu left in a hurry. He stepped out of the door and looked up at the sky. His lips curled into a smile and he said eerily, "Li Jiang of Silla, we'll meet soon. Are you surprised? Are you surprised? Aren't you going to get married soon? I'll give you a big gift before your wedding." Inside the house, Fang Yu looked at the person behind him and said, "Go get a new almanac." "Yes, guardian." The person nodded and immediately went out. Soon he came back with a new almanac. The 11th of the first month of the year of Ikai. This is the heaven's wish for the holy religion to make Ikai. Fang Yu was very satisfied with this and nodded. He looked at the person and said, "You may leave first." "Yes." The disciple walked out. He still had a little doubt in his heart. The almanac said Ikai, but it didn't say who Ikai was. What if it was Ikai? Somewhere on a mountain in the fringe. Several figures were climbing the mountain path with difficulty. They were panting from exhaustion. "I say, why don't we take the main road? Why do we have to climb over the mountains? Don't complain. Although the main road has been repaired by those baldies, it's still better to take shortcuts quickly. If you delay His Highness' business, be careful of your head. Say, do you think that Baldy's place is really as good as they say? A city in the mountains with restaurants, brothels, and even a school? I don't believe it. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. You'll know when you see it with your own eyes." The group was chatting as they climbed the mountain. When they reached a certain point, the view before them suddenly opened up. A clear path led straight to the top of the mountain. As far as the eye could see, there seemed to be the shadows of buildings hidden in the forest. Just as the group took a few steps forward, several arrows suddenly shot out from the forest and stabbed into the ground in front of them. The person walking at the front couldn't help but break out in cold sweat. If those arrows had been a few inches higher, his foot would have been pierced through. Chapter 10:22. The Heavenly King covers the Earth Tiger. Just as the few of them were shocked, a cold voice came from the forest. On the mountain path the leader was stunned. When he regained his senses he immediately said, I know, the pagoda suppresses the river demon. It's the pagoda suppresses the river demon. We're on the same side. Muha. Sawadika. Why are you blushing? Lin Zhong's voice softened as he asked again. That person immediately said, I'm in high spirits. Why is it yellow again? It's a wax to prevent the cold. After a while, a voice came from the forest. Continue forward, there will be someone ahead to receive you. This was considered a code. The few of them were relieved. These baldies were indeed very particular. Before entering the village they had to memorize so many codes. Moreover, they sounded more powerful, like the slang of bandits. Unlike their own prince, who had learned everything from others and insisted on changing the code to, the king of Shu is not a fish in a pond, he will transform into a dragon in the face of a storm. They were too embarrassed to mention it to others. In comparison, although the code of these baldies was complicated and difficult to remember, it was much more shameless than the king of Shu's. Thank you, brother. One of them cupped his hands at Lin Zhong, and the few of them quickly disappeared on the mountain path. Not long after, another figure slowly walked along the mountain path. When he walked under a tree he stopped and looked into the forest. His lips moved slightly. Beep beep. He made 2 sounds, 1 long and 2 short sounds. Secret codes like Heavenly King covers the Earth Tiger, which had been eliminated by them, were used to distinguish between friend and foe. Their secret codes had long been upgraded and changed every half a month. If an enemy wanted to pretend to be one of their comrades they would die a horrible death. Beep beep. He did not stand in place for long. Soon the same response came from the forest. Another youth with a bow and arrow walked out of the forest. He looked at him and nodded, saying, They're back. They're back. That person nodded as well. He took out an item from his sleeve and handed it over, saying, This is the attack plan and route map. Remember to let them bring it when they leave. Send my regards to the king and the alliance master. What's the hurry? It's only a few days. You can ask them yourself. I'm leaving. See you later. After a brief exchange, the young man with the bow and arrow on his back once again hid in the forest, while the figure of the other person also slowly disappeared from the mountain path. At the top of the mountain, the few of them stood on the bluestone paved street and looked at the city in front of them. They were dumbstruck and couldn't take another step forward. Neat streets, rows upon rows of shops, and rows upon rows of neat wooden houses looked exactly the same from the outside. Even outside the fringe it was rare to see such a scene in the big cities of the Jing kingdom. Compared to the territory of these baldies, the place they lived in was at most a kennel. This was Li Yi's first New Year's Eve in Shuzhou. Although they were far away from the capital, the atmosphere of the new year was even stronger. Perhaps it was because there were fewer social activities, only a simple family. It was just like the pure New Year when he first came here. The only difference was that the people of Shuzhou were too enthusiastic. In just a few days, the Jianghu of Silla residents received a few houses full of gifts. Although they weren't valuable, they still represented the people's goodwill. Li Yi also asked the gatekeeper to prepare red envelopes for all the people who came to his residence with gifts. This was considered reciprocity. Shuzhou had already begun to develop rapidly. The lives of the people would get better and better, and their wallets would naturally become more and more full. Although there was still a big gap from the level he had hoped for, some things could not be achieved overnight. It was almost impossible for a state to catch up with the capital without 10 or 20 years of development. All he had to do now was to wait patiently. Fang walked in from outside with an envelope in his hand. After opening it, Li Yi looked at it and said, So, they have a spy in Yong County who has the ability to secretly open the west gate on the night of the 11th day of the first month? That's what they said, but they didn't say who it was. Fang nodded and said, I've already asked Old Chen to investigate. It's very simple. It's the person who was in charge of guarding the west gate that day. Very soon, people from the provincial governor's estate arrived. Li Yi looked at the things that Qin Chong had sent over. The officer who was usually in charge of guarding the west gate had been knocked on the head by someone on his way home after drinking last night and was slightly injured. His duty had been temporarily taken over by one of his subordinates. Li put down the paper and said in a small voice, "Captain, son-in-law, I suddenly have an idea," Fang suddenly said after some thought. Li turned his head to look at him. "What idea?" "I think that ambushing people on the walls to shoot arrows, splash boiling oil, throw stones, this is a bit too troublesome." He looked at Li and thought for a moment. "Son-in-law, what do you think about directly throwing in heavenly punishment?" Li was startled. Isn't this a bit too much?" "It's not too much." Fang slapped his thigh and said, "I think this is a very good idea. It's simple and direct. Throw in a few heavenly punishments, and the people will think that it's New Year's firecrackers. Before daybreak we can just send the city guards over to clean up the mess. One shouldn't be too Fang. One should always leave a way out in the future. Throwing in a few heavenly punishments would not blow up the king of Shu or the bandits of the holy religion. It would blow up the productivity. Shu province was about to enter a stable stage of development. After things settled down here and the king of Shu and emissary of the right were defeated, they would officially start marching into the land of chaos. At that time they would be most lacking in manpower. Therefore these people couldn't be blown up. It's better to prepare archers. Li said after some thought. Fang looked at him and asked, "What if they put up a fierce resistance and would rather die than surrender?" Li thought for a moment and added, "Prepare more heavenly punishments as well just in case." Throughout the year even the usually quiet and desolate Yong County would become lively and bustling. The liveliness reached a climax during the New Year's Day and then gradually subsided. It was only after the 10th day of the new year that there were signs of recovery. All the people in the city had to prepare for the upcoming Lantern Festival. Today was the 11th day of the new year. The streets in the city were not crowded. A few months ago Shu province had lifted the curfew. However, due to the large number of people during the New Year's Day, it was difficult to maintain law and order. In the days before the Lantern Festival, people were not allowed to walk on the streets after midnight. At this moment it was still early. The shops and houses in the city were still brightly lit. However, outside the city most of the people had already gone to bed. 10 miles away from the west gate of Yong County, on the dark and difficult-to-walk mountain path, a crowd of people suddenly appeared. At the front of the crowd, Fang Yu looked at the person beside him and said in a low voice, "Tell them to hurry up. We have to hurry. We must reach the west gate before midnight." "Yes, Guardian." The person responded and immediately turned to walk to the back. On the other side, the king of Shu turned and asked, "Can your people in the city be trusted?" Fang Yu nodded and said in a deep voice, "Don't worry. There are some spies in the holy religion that only purple-clothed emissaries and above are qualified to contact. At midnight they will open the west gate. When that time comes we will march straight in. You lead the people and charge straight to the Jianghu of Silla residence. We will be responsible for dealing with the guards in Yong County. We will meet outside the west gate in 2 hours. Chapter 1023. Hearing Fang Yu's words, the king of Shu nodded with a pleased smile on his face. This time they had mobilized more than 3,000 men, all carefully selected elites. Wouldn't it be a piece of cake to take down Yong County, which only had a few hundred soldiers? He finally had the chance to settle the score with that person. Fang Yu turned around and saw the king of Shu's ferocious face under the moonlight. He frowned and reminded, "Don't forget, we want to capture him alive this time. When we get the information we need, you can do whatever you want to him." He knew about the blood feud between the king of Shu and Li. He was worried that the king of Shu would kill him in a fit of rage. If that happened, the holy religion would be in vain. They missed the chance to force the king of Tianfa to reveal the secret recipe last time, but they couldn't miss it this time. The king of Shu nodded and said eerily, "Don't worry, I can't bear to kill him so quickly. I want to bring him back and play with him slowly." After reminding the king of Shu, Fang Yu looked at the bald man on the other side and cupped his fists. "Commander Wang, the success of tonight's operation depends on you." Wang Wei smiled and said, "You don't have to worry about that. As long as you can fulfill your promise, leave the soldiers of Yong County to us." "Ambassador Fang, do you still not believe in our strength and reputation?" Wang Wei looked at him and said with a faint smile. Fang Yu cupped his fists again. "Thank you, Commander Wang. I trust your reputation." The key to this operation was the 1,000 men led by the bald man. They were powerful and extremely difficult to deal with. Without them, the holy religion would suffer heavy losses. When the time came, they would be the vanguard, and the holy religion would just have to fulfill their conditions afterward. If there were any accidents and the holy religion suffered heavy losses, it wouldn't matter. The territories of these bald men in the fringe could be taken over by the holy religion. No matter what, he wouldn't be at a disadvantage. At first he was worried that these baldies would easily agree to this and that there might be some kind of trap. But now that things had come to this, there was no turning back. If there was a trap, it could only be that they were colluding with the government and Li, but an official and a bandit, a soldier and a thief, was this possible? Yong County West Gate. The curfew had arrived and the shopping malls were all closed. Only a row of soldiers carrying 2 lanterns patrolled back and forth. The West Gate was different from the other 3 gates. Once out of the gate, one would be at the foot of the mountain. There were very few pedestrians there, so the gate was not open all year round. Originally, there was no need for night patrols. Recently, because of the construction of a shopping mall here, they temporarily added such a team to guard against bandits. Late at night before the Lantern Festival, it was still very cold. Being blown by the cold wind, the patrolling soldiers walked more than a dozen laps and felt a little annoyed. However, this was their duty, not to mention that the team leader was still around, so they did not dare to relax at all. After an unknown number of laps, the person at the front signaled for everyone to stop and asked, "What time is it now?" One of them replied, "Sir, it should be almost midnight." "It's already at this time?" The team leader said, then turned around and said, "There aren't so many bandits in the city now. There's no need for so many people to be exposed to the cold wind here. How about this, the few of you go back and rest first. After 2 hours, come back and replace us." The people who were pointed out by him were stunned and immediately said, "It's better if the team leader goes back and rest first. We can still hold on." The team leader waved his hand and said, "If I tell you to go, just go. What's with all this nonsense? I still want to walk around a little longer and go back to sleep later in the night." At this point, those people no longer insisted. The captain was injured, so the patrolling of the West Gate was under the responsibility of Captain Su. Naturally, they had to obey his arrangements. The public security of Yong County was good now, and the patrolling was just a casual process. There would not be any major incidents. "Thank you, team leader." The few people nodded, cupped their hands at Captain Su and dispersed. When their figures completely disappeared, Captain Su looked in the direction of the city gate and murmured, "It's about time. Hurry up, don't delay the great emissary's important matter." He led a few figures through the shopping mall and hurried in the direction of the city gate. In the dense forest outside the western city gate of Yong County, a bald man looked at the city wall that was faintly discernible in the darkness and said in a low voice, "Hey Envoy Fong, is the person you're talking about reliable? Can he be trusted? Will he stand us up?" Fong Yu did not look back. He looked in the direction of the city wall and shook his head. "Impossible. The people of my holy religion are loyal to Her Majesty. They are absolutely trustworthy. Loyal to Her Majesty." Wang Wei thought for a moment and asked, "Then why can't you contact those believers in Shuzhou?" Fang Yu's chest heaved and he said firmly, "Don't worry, Commander Wang. This time there will definitely be no problem." "That's hard to say." Wang Wei shook his head, looked at him and reminded him, "Brother Fong, don't blame me for not reminding you. The moral degeneration of the world is getting worse, and people's hearts are not what they used to be. Some people call you brothers on the surface and seem to be on your side, but they are actually spies of the enemy. At the critical moment, they will betray you and make all your previous efforts go to waste. You have to be careful." All of Fang Yu's attention was on the city gate. Hearing this, he waved his hand and said, "Commander Wang, you worry too much. Do not have the heart to harm others, but do not have the heart to guard against others." Before Wang Wei finished speaking, as if to confirm Fang Yu's words in the darkness, the tightly closed city gate suddenly opened a gap. Then it opened wider and wider, until it was completely open. "The city gate is open." The king of Shu suppressed his voice and said in a low and excited voice, "How is it? Do you believe me now, Commander Wang?" Fang Yu glanced at him and said with a smile, "Brothers, what are you waiting for? Charge." Wang Wei looked behind him and said to the people behind him. Then he took the lead and led hundreds of people towards the city gate. The king of Shu and Fang Yu looked at them charging in front, and a smile appeared on their faces. These baldies were really trustworthy to charge in front to attack a city. After Wang Wei and his people rushed down, the king of Shu followed closely behind. According to the intelligence, after rushing through the city gate, they would enter the so-called shopping mall. In the middle of the shopping mall was a huge open space, surrounded by shops, forming a ring shape. The open space in the middle was very big, and it did not seem crowded even when more than 2,000 people rushed in at once. Fang Yu, on the other hand, followed behind everyone with an indifferent expression. This time, after capturing Li Yi and getting the formula of Tianfa out of him, he could not let the King of Shu kill him. He wanted to let Her Majesty see that there were times when her judgment was wrong. So what if it was Jianghu of Silla? So what if it was the left emissary? In the end, didn't they still fall into his hands? Fang Yu thought to himself. When he rushed to the city gate, he looked left and right, but did not see anyone around the city wall that he was hoping to see. He had an agreement with the spies in the city. If the city gate was opened, they would stand outside the city wall and nothing would go wrong. Otherwise, something unexpected had happened. He stopped in his tracks almost instantly, and once again confirmed that there was no one around the city wall. His expression changed drastically and he said anxiously, "Retreat, retreat quickly." He turned around quickly and the two men in purple followed closely behind him. In an instant, they disappeared into the dense forest. The momentum of 3,000 people was so great that only a few dozen people who were closest to him could react. Most of the people had already rushed into the city. At this moment, the King of Shu had already rushed in. His face was full of excitement as he shouted, "Follow me to the Jianghu of Silla's residence and capture Li Yi alive. There's no need to go through so much trouble, I'm right here." A voice came from above. Suddenly, dozens of flames appeared on the city wall. Li Yi stood at the brightest spot on the city wall, looked at the King of Shu and said, "Come up here." Looking at the figure on the city wall that he could not see clearly, but he felt a sense of familiarity from the depths of his soul, the King of Shu's expression froze. Chapter 1024. Bang. After a heavy sound, the gate of the shopping mall, which was originally open, was closed. With the light of the fire, one could see that above the city wall were rows of densely packed arrows. In other words, they were surrounded by people. Seeing the densely packed figures on the city wall, especially the faintly discernible face in the fire that he would never forget, the King of Shu's expression changed drastically. He spat out the name through gritted teeth. "I said to be careful of spies." Wang Wei led 1,000 people to block the city gate that they had just entered from. He looked at the King of Shu and shook his head. "Your Highness, look, I didn't overthink, did I? 100 people go and capture Envoy Fang." Wang Wei looked back. Although he didn't know how Envoy Fang saw through them and escaped without entering the city, he couldn't let this big fish escape after planning for so long. Immediately, some people went out of the city gate while the rest closed the city gate. The King of Shu was stunned. After a long time he came back to his senses and looked at him. His eyes widened and he said in disbelief, "You, I'm sorry, I'm a spy." Wang Wei looked at him and said, "Your Highness, give up your fearless resistance and surrender." Beside the King of Shu, several people immediately shouted, "Protect His Highness." They looked around and said loudly, "Everyone, don't panic. We have the numbers. Follow me and kill our way out." "Kill our way out?" Wang Wei looked at them and weighed something in his hand. He said, "Do you know what this is? This is heavenly punishment. As long as I throw this out with a boom, you will F***ck, who the F***ck ignited it." Seeing that the fuse of the thing in his hand was about to burn out, Wang Wei hurriedly threw the heavenly punishment out. Boom. Although he threw it at the corner of the wall, and the heavenly punishment was a low-quality version with limited power, more than 10 people in the King of Shu's group who were closest to it fell to the ground, moaning in pain. The fire in his eyes had yet to dissipate, and his ears were buzzing, mixed with the moans of the people around him. The power of the heavenly punishment made it so that no one dared to act rashly. "If anyone dares to resist, I'll let you have a taste of heavenly punishment." Countless figures had already come down from the city wall, and a dense wave of arrows was aimed at the people in the middle of the open space. The King of Shu's face turned pale in an instant. There were originally 3,000 people in the Allied army, but because there was a spy in the middle, it suddenly became 2,000 people. They foolishly rushed into the city gate, but were surrounded here like dumplings, unable to advance or retreat. "Put down your weapons and surrender immediately. Fight for leniency. If you resist, kill without mercy." Wang Wei held a paper tube in his hand and shouted, "Those who surrender, stand on the left. Those who don't, stand on the right. Everyone move, follow me and kill." Someone in the crowd had just said a few words when an arrow shot out from the front and hit him right between the eyebrows. The man fell to the ground and the people around him immediately scattered. Seeing this, Wang Wei's voice became cold as he said, "If you resist again, you will be punished by the heavens. Everyone, don't be afraid. We have the advantage in numbers. Follow me and kill." Among the crowd, another person revealed a fierce expression. However, just as he finished speaking, there was a commotion beside him. He saw that the surrounding people were avoiding him as if he was the plague and distanced themselves from him. Everyone knew that they were surrounded here and there was no way out. As long as the people above kept shooting arrows, they would be easily taken care of. Not to mention that the other party had the heavenly punishment divine weapon, which was extraordinarily powerful. If the other party threw one over, wouldn't they be implicated? At the city gate, Wang Wei had already lit an incense stick. He continued to raise his megaphone and shouted, "Those who surrender stand on the left. Those who don't surrender stand on the right. Move, all of you, move. You only have 5 minutes. After that, immediately release the arrows." As soon as he finished speaking, there was a clamor of footsteps from the crowd. Wang Wei looked at the dense crowd and shouted, "Yes, just like that. Put down your weapons, put your hands behind your head and squat." Not only did they not have the advantage in numbers, but they were also surrounded by the other party. Emissary Feng of the right was nowhere to be seen, and the holy religion was without a leader. Under Wang Wei's coercion, they could only stand on the left. After the time it took for half an incense stick to burn, the king of Shu looked at the remaining people around him and murmured, "They're gone, they're all gone." Li came down from the city wall and walked to the king of Shu. The king of Shu looked at the few people around him, and then at the bald men pointing arrows at them. His gaze finally stopped on Li. At this time, it had been less than 4 years since they first met. He still remembered that their first meeting was at the Cold Mountain Temple. In the second year of Jinghe's reign, the plum blossoms in the Cold Mountain Temple were in full bloom. He stood together with Li Xian, whom he hated the most. From that time on, he didn't like this scholar of the Jing kingdom, who had just made a name for himself. At that time he was still the king of Shu, the prince closest to that position. He disregarded his feud with Li Xian and condescended to invite him to a banquet at the king's mansion. But what about him? He and Li Xian made a mess of his banquet, making him a laughing stock in the circle of the nobles in the capital. Then he beat him up in the palace in front of all the court officials, seriously injuring him, and continued to get away with it. Then he uprooted his power in the court one by one. He drove him out of the capital. He made him get further and further away from that position, the position that he had dreamed of for more than 20 years. Then he extinguished his last shred of hope. The Cui family fell, his mother died, he became a fugitive, and he became the Jianghu of Silla. He took over his fief and his mansion. Now he had finally found a chance to wash away the shame he had suffered. However, Li was standing right in front of him. They had never been so close to each other, nor had they been so far away from each other. The moment he met Li, he missed his whole life. How good would it have been if he hadn't met Li in the winter when the plum blossoms were in full bloom in the second year of Jinghe? However, there were no ifs. Cough, cough. The king of Shu bent over and couldn't stop coughing. He covered his mouth, but blood still seeped out from between his fingers. He suddenly pulled out a saber from the waist of a guard beside him and slashed at Li. A crazed look appeared on his face. Li, I'm going to kill you." Li pinched the tip of the saber. No matter how much strength the king of Shu used, the long saber couldn't move an inch. He exerted a little force and the saber flew out of the king of Shu's hand. He casually threw it to the ground, making a crisp clang sound. The king of Shu's body fell limply to the ground. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. He lowered his head and panted heavily. "Haha, you traitors, I am the emperor. How dare you rebel?" At a certain moment he suddenly raised his head and pointed at Li. He took a few deep breaths and his face was no longer pale. Instead it turned rosy. He got up from the ground, put one hand on his waist and laughed wildly. "Li Jiang of Silla, you are just a prince. Why don't you kneel before me? Treason, you are treason. I want to punish you for your crimes, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to exterminate your entire family." Li looked at the crazed king of Shu and shook his head. He waved his hand and said, "Take him away. Don't touch me." The expression on the king of Shu's face became terrified. He shouted, "You unruly people. Where is the imperial army? Guards. These unruly people want to harm me." Chapter 1025. On the morning of the 12th day of the first lunar month, Butcher Zheng opened the door with dark circles under his eyes and saw the waiter of the restaurant across the street sitting listlessly on the threshold. Butcher Zheng glanced at him and said, "Hey Gooden, what did you do last night? Why are you so sleepy?" The waiter glanced at him and said weakly, "How dare you say that? If your wife hadn't screamed last night, the whole street would have heard her. How could I be so sleepy? If you two do that again next time. It's none of your business whether my wife screamed or not. Why can't you sleep?" Butcher Zheng looked at him with a dark face and asked, "Next time? What do you want to do next time?" The waiter named Gooden was stunned. He looked at him and asked in surprise, "Can I?" Butcher Zheng picked up a boning knife and tilted his ear, asking, Come over here and tell me what you want to do. I just want to tell you that you must have public morality. Do you want me and my neighbors to go and play drums and cheer for you next time?" The waiter shook his head. Butcher Zheng's wife was stronger than him. Even looking at Butcher Zheng was more interesting than looking at his wife. He stood up and said angrily, "I don't know who it was last night who set off firecrackers in the middle of the night. It was so loud that I felt the bed move. I was woken up just as I fell asleep. Don't let me catch that bastard. If I do, I'll skin him alive." Butcher Zheng didn't care about the guy who set off firecrackers last night. He was also angry with that bastard. Yesterday he was preparing to have a baby with his wife. At the critical moment he was scared out of his wits by the sound of firecrackers. Later he found his wits, but he was lost. He was only allowed to go to bed after being kicked a few times by his wife who hadn't had enough fun. Speaking of that person, Butcher Zheng was enraged. He waved the knife in his hand and said angrily, "If I catch him, I'll cut his bones." Last night, many people in Yong County didn't sleep well, especially those near the West City Gate. A few days ago, when there was no curfew, everyone's nightlife would last until very late. These days, after the curfew, as soon as the sky turned dark, it was time to sleep. But regardless of whether they were sleeping or sleeping, they were all startled by the loud noise that occurred around midnight last night. The sound was so loud that even the ground beneath their feet shook. The first impression it gave people was that the sky had collapsed. Some people even mistakenly thought that it was an earth dragon turning over and hurriedly ran out of their houses. They stayed outside for most of the night and only dared to walk back into their rooms after seeing that nothing was out of place. During the day, everything returned to normal. The shops opened for business, and the commoners continued with their daily activities. Observant people would notice that a part of the city wall in the shopping mall was slightly charred, as if it had been burned. Most people only cursed the fellow who had fired the cannon in their hearts. Wang Wei didn't realize that he was responsible for firing the cannon last night. He stood in front of Li Yi, shook his head and said with some regret, "Prince, the rest of the people from the holy religion have been captured. 2 of the purple-clothed emissaries escaped, and that emissary Fang of the right has also escaped. I've already sent my brothers to their lair. This time their elites have all gone, so it'll be easy to wipe them out." Fang rubbed his shiny head and said regretfully, "Young master, I was too rash. I shouldn't have captured those fellows who opened the city gate yesterday. Otherwise, that Fang guy." Halfway through his sentence he realized that his surname was also Fang, so he added, "That emissary of the right won't be able to escape." Li waved his hand and said, "It's all right. If he escaped, then so be it. We'll meet again in the future. Let's talk about it next time." This time he managed to capture the king of Shu and the elites of the holy religion in the fringe without losing a single soldier. He also managed to capture more than 2,000 people. What else could he be dissatisfied with? Not only did emissary Fang of the right escape, but he also left the king of Shu alive. To him, the king of Shu was obviously more important than Fang Yu. Ever since he entered the capital, he and the king of Shu had never stopped fighting openly and secretly. It was only yesterday that their feud finally came to an end. However, even he didn't expect that it would end up like this. After experiencing the ups and downs of life, he never got up again. He fell many times, and when he finally got the chance to get up again, he fell from heaven to hell in an instant. The king of Shu actually went crazy. When he was taken away, he was still shouting things like, "Protect the emperor, rebel," and "There are always unruly people who want to harm the emperor." After he went crazy, he imagined himself to be the emperor. He had wanted to be the emperor all his life, and now his dream had finally come true. Although he was only deceiving himself, at least he succeeded. Fang touched his bald head again and asked, "Son-in-law, what should we do with the king of Shu?" Li stood up and said, "I'll go see him first." After Li Yi left, Wang Wei looked at Fang and asked, "Brother Fang, is a bald head good to touch? How does it feel?" Fang nodded and said, "Not bad. Even if it feels good." Wang Wei removed the hand that was rubbing his head and asked, "Can't you touch your own head?" "You're crazy?" Fang glanced at him and said, "If I had a bald head, would I need to touch yours?" His words were eloquent and reasonable. Wang Wei opened his mouth, but he didn't know how to refute. The king of Shu was temporarily imprisoned in the manor prison. When Li Yi walked in, Qin Chong followed behind him and said, "The king of Shu has been making a big fuss since last night, calling himself we. Last night while he was asleep I had a doctor take a look at him. He said that his pulse is extremely chaotic. It should be because he suffered a huge psychological blow and his mind is injured. Perhaps he will wake up after a period of time, or perhaps he will be like this forever." How could he not be shocked? If the king of Shu had not suffered a psychological blow, then the one being imprisoned would be Li Yi himself. After saying a few words, Qin Chong looked at him and asked, "What do you plan to do with the king of Shu?" Li Yi looked at the innermost cell and said, "Send him back to the capital." In the innermost cell of the manor prison, the king of Shu placed his hands on his hips and raised his head. He looked at the people in the cell next door and said loudly, "You unruly people, why don't you kneel when you see us? Let us tell you, our reinforcements will be here soon. If you kneel before us now, we will get them to save you all in a while. Humph, you unruly people, how dare you not kneel when you see us? We will not get anyone to save you." The people in the cell next door leaned against the wall and sighed as they looked at the king of Shu, who was talking to himself. How could a normal person go crazy just like that? The king of Shu turned around angrily and suddenly saw a familiar figure. After a moment of shock, he immediately laughed wildly and said, Lord Qin, you're here. Are you here to save us?" "Haha, you unruly people, do you see that? Our reinforcements are here. Lord Qin is here to save us. It's not too late for you to kneel before us now." Looking at the king of Shu laughing wildly in the cell, Qin Chong stopped in his tracks. The expression on his face was extremely complicated. No matter what, the Qin family had been loyal to the king of Shu for a period of time. Seeing this scene, he felt a different feeling in his heart. "Lord Qin, quickly come and save us. When we return, we will make you the prime minister. Tell us what you want to be, and when we return, we will make you." His gaze swept to the side, and when he saw the person standing beside Qin Chong, his expression changed drastically. He hid in a corner and shouted, "Li Yi, you traitor, you captured us, you want a rebel. Imperial father will not let you off, Imperial mother will not let you off, no one in the world will let you off." After shouting a few words, he quickly ran over and grabbed the bars. With a face full of anticipation, he said, Li Yi, let me go. Let me go, please. Don't you remember? Have you forgotten that I treated you to a meal? I even treated you to a meal." Seeing the king of Shu like this, Li Yi's heart was also filled with mixed feelings. If he had known this would happen, he wouldn't have done it in the first place. He just wanted to live a good life, Rui and the others. Whether the king of Shu became the emperor or not had nothing to do with him. If not for that meal, if not for Qin Yu, perhaps the two of them would not have such an ending today. The king of Shu knelt on the ground and said loudly, Li Yi, let me go. Whatever you want, I can give it to you." At some point, a look of understanding appeared on his face and he said loudly, I know what you want. This emperor will give it to you, this emperor will give it to you, this emperor will give it to you. Release this emperor will immediately add an edict for Mingzhu to marry you. Let me go. Not only will I let Mingzhu marry you, I will also let Li Xian marry you. Chapter 1026. Li looked at Qin Chong, who was staring at him with a strange gaze, and explained, "Don't look at me like that. His Majesty and I are innocent." "And with the princess?" "With the princess, it's just holding hands and kissing the cheek. That's all. There's nothing else." "I know." Qin Chong nodded. "You and His Majesty are innocent." Li looked at him and said, "But the look in your eyes hasn't changed." Qin Chong lowered his head and said nothing. Of all the officials in court, only he and His Majesty believed that they were innocent. Everyone knew that His Majesty and Jianghu of Silla were as close as brothers and that His Majesty favored him even more than Her Majesty the Empress. Who would believe that they were innocent? But he could not say this in front of Qin Chong. Based on his understanding of Li Yi, if he bore a grudge against you, he would not fall out with you on the surface, but he would make things difficult for you in the future. Everyone knew of His Highness Jianghu of Silla's pettiness, just like his relationship with His Majesty. He changed his gaze and said, "The king of Shu is like this. How can I bring him back to the capital?" Qin Chang's words were reasonable. The king of Shu had been a respectable person before he went crazy. It would be too shameful to have him return to the capital like this. It would not only hurt the king of Shu's own face, but also the face of the imperial family. Li ordered the jailer behind him, "Open the prison door." The jailer did not ask any questions and went forward to open the door. Thank you. The king of Shu walked out and said seriously, "I will send Emingzu to your room today, and the day after tomorrow I will send Li Xian." Thump. Li reached out and lightly chopped at the king of Shu's neck. The king fell to the ground. This is much more respectable. Li looked at Qin Chong and said, "Don't delay this matter. Tomorrow secretly escort him back to the capital. If he continues to make trouble on the way, just knock him out." Qin Chong was startled, then nodded. "Okay." He pointed at the unconscious king of Shu and ordered the jailer, "Bring him back first." "Why did he go crazy?" The jailer sighed. The king of Shu, who was lying on the ground, suddenly jumped up and grabbed him by the neck. He said angrily, "I'm not crazy. I'm the emperor. I'm the ruler of a country. You unruly people. Bang. Qin Chong chopped down on the king of Shu's neck with even greater force than Li Yi's. The king of Shu fell to the ground again. Qin Chong waved his hand and said, "Take him away." "Son-in-law, do you think the madness of the king of Shu is real?" Fang squatted on the ground, looked at Li Yi and asked, "It's said that there are people who are unwilling to remember certain things because they suffered a blow, so they sealed a part of their memories. It sounds very mysterious. Is there really such a thing?" "Really?" Li Yi said casually. Although this kind of thing sounded mysterious, it was not uncommon in the history of medicine. It was no longer important whether the king of Shu was really crazy or not. Based on Li Xian's style of doing things, he might not kill the king of Shu. However, the king of Shu would not be able to leave the capital in this lifetime. As for the one imprisoned in the capital, what difference did it make whether the king of Shu was really crazy or not? Now that the matter with the king of Shu had come to an end, he was thinking about other matters. This time the king of Shu was captured and Fang Yu escaped. They had already taken over the fringe. However, they still could not find Fang Yu. When they arrived, the fringe was already deserted. Only a few bandits who were captured were left behind. The fringe was huge. Even if the king of Shu, Fang Yu, and the others joined forces, they could only occupy a small piece of land. Of course, no matter which side they were on, they were still one of the few major powers in the fringe. Now, the territories near the Jing kingdom and the Qi kingdom had been unified by them. Only some major powers in the north near the Wu kingdom had yet to be conquered. Li Yi, Wang Wei, and the others discussed for a while and decided not to make a move so soon. They would wait until they had stabilized their current territories before advancing. When that time came, the fringe would have to change its surname. Whether it was Li or Lu, it was all the same. Moreover, the surname Lu would eventually belong to the surname Li. These details could be ignored for the time being. Fang squatted on the ground. He was waiting for Li Yi to explain to him. However, Li Yi only gave a perfunctory reply and did not say anything else. He had already noticed that the young master did not seem to like to talk to him recently. Thinking about it carefully, other than the time when the princess sent a letter to Mississippi Lu, he did not offend him in any way. He thought for a moment and took out a letter from his sleeve. He said, "Young master, actually, the princess sent me a letter today. I didn't let second miss see it." Li quietly hid the letter in his sleeve. He did not know why, but when he looked at Fang again, he found him much more pleasing to the eye. "Not bad. You did a good job this time." He patted Fang's shoulder and quietly returned to his room. He closed the door and leaned against it. He couldn't wait to take out the letter from his sleeve. He had been waiting for this letter from Emingzu for a long time. On the cover there were 4 big words, "To Li Yi." Li Yi was startled and his face darkened. He glared fiercely at the door. This Fang, is he stupid? This is a letter from Emingzu, not from Mississippi Lu. Why is he acting so secretive? It's like he's meeting with an underground gang. What's there to be afraid of when it's his own letter? Li Yi was stunned when he opened the letter. There was no letter paper. There was no letter paper in the envelope. Could it be that when she sent the letter she forgot to put the content in it? Li Yi's eyes were a little moist. It was not easy for him to wait for a letter from her. It had been 9 months. He was about to marry Zumo Ruoqing, but he only waited for such a letter, and it was a letter without content. Did she let him imagine it himself? He turned the envelope over and over, but still did not find the content of the letter. But he found a bunch of hair in the envelope. This hair should not have been put in accidentally because it was not one or a few strands, but a bunch tied with a red band. It was not long and one end was the tip of the hair, and the other end was cut very neatly. It should have been cut with a sharp tool such as scissors. It was very strange for Emingzu to write a letter. Last time she sent a beating and asked Rui to do it. This time she sent a bunch of hair. Why didn't she send a kiss and ask Rui to do it? Li was about to sit down and study it. After taking 2 steps, he saw Rui sitting at the desk, holding a book in his hand and looking at him. He was stunned and asked, "Rui, when did you come here?" "It's been an hour." Mississippi Lu put down the book in her hand, looked at him and asked, "What's in your hand?" Li looked down at it, then looked at her and said, "A letter." Mississippi Lu asked, "Li Emingzi sent it?" Li was surprised and said, "How do you know?" "When Uncle Fong secretly gave it to you just now, I heard it." Li Yi straightened the envelope and pointed at the words for Li Yi on it. He said solemnly, "You see, this time it's for me. I didn't peek at your letter." Mississippi Lu nodded and asked, "What did she say?" Then she added, "Of course if it's something private I won't ask. After all, I'm not like some people who have a hobby of prying into other people's privacy." Li didn't like what she said. What did she mean by having a hobby of prying into other people's privacy? That was concern. Concern was to help her and Emingzu establish the right outlook on life, values and the world. She didn't want them to go astray. What's so good about prying into other people's privacy? You'll get beaten for prying into other people's privacy. It was obvious that she wanted to know, but she pretended that she didn't care. Ah, women, what privacy? In order to prove his innocence, Li Yi handed over the envelope and said, "There's no privacy between us. You can take a look." Mississippi Lu took the envelope, opened it and looked at Li Yi. Li Yi looked at the empty envelope and was stunned. After a while, he looked at her and asked, "If I say that she didn't say anything and there's no letter in this envelope, would you believe me?" Chapter 10:27. There's no letter in this letter. Do you believe me? Li Yi looked at Mississippi Lu with a sincere expression. Other than the tongue twister that almost made him bite his tongue, he did not seem to be faking it at all. Because he was not faking it at all. Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "Are you talking about tongue twisters?" "Speaking of tongue twisters, I've actually studied them some time ago." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, 800 soldiers rushed to the north slope, red carp and green carp and donkey, black fertilizer evaporates and turns black, gray fertilizer evaporates and turns black, gray fertilizer evaporates and turns black. Yes, play. Li Yi stopped talking about tongue twisters because he just bit his tongue and it hurt. Mississippi Lu shook her head and said, "I know there's nothing in that letter. I saw it just now. I'm just joking." She stood up and picked up the book she was reading just now. She said, "By the way, lend this book to me for 2 days. I'll return it to you when I'm done." "What book?" Li Yi asked casually. "Qin Shimi and Qin Xianglian." Mississippi Lu waved her hand and said, "It's about the ungrateful Qin Shimi who married a princess and abandoned his wife. In the end he was killed by Master Bao. This kind of ungrateful, fickle person." Li Yi found that Mississippi Lu's use of idioms was getting better and better. But that was not the main point. The main point was that she only needed to tell him what book she had borrowed. He wrote the script himself. Didn't he know what kind of story Qin Shimi and Qin Xianglian was about? Did he ask her what the book was about? All women. Cough, cough. Seeing Mississippi Lu's gaze, Li Yi coughed twice and walked over. He took a book from the table and handed it to her. He said, "If you have time you should read this book. It's quite good. Girls should read more." Mississippi Lu reached out and took it. She asked, "What book is this?" "A Huang and Nuying." Li Yi looked at her and explained, "This book is about Emperor Yao having 2 daughters. The elder sister is a Huang and the younger sister is Nuying. Both sisters follow the teachings of the court, nurturing themselves and are pure in nature. One is gentle and virtuous, beautiful and intelligent, while the other is unruly, unreasonable and barbaric. They are both sisters, but why is the difference between them so big?" Seeing the change in Mississippi Lu's gaze, Li Yi hurriedly said, "Of course none of this is important. What's important? Mississippi Lu continued to ask. "I forgot." Li Yi sat in front of the desk and said, "It's boring to listen to others talk about it. It's better for you to see for yourself." Mississippi Lu turned around and walked out of the room. As she walked out of the room, Li Yi suddenly remembered something and quickly said, "Rui, wait a minute." Mississippi Lu turned around and looked at him. Li thought for a moment and asked, Rui, if you are a woman? No, you are a woman. What does it mean to give someone a bunch of hair? Soon, drunk Imo and Ruoqing would enter the door. Li Xin could not come, but he did not forget the gift. According to what he said in the letter, it was a generous gift, but Emingzu only gave a bunch of hair. This was too unkind. Hair, wishing that he would have a good start in the new year? Black hair tied to the hair, forever tied to the same heart. When a woman gives her hair to a man, it means that she has fallen in love with him. When a husband and wife get married, they also have to tie the hair. Mississippi Lu explained, looked at him and asked, Why did a woman give you hair? Li put his left hand behind his back, shook his head and said solemnly, No, how could it be? Fang watched the son-in-law walk into the room with the letter and close the door. After a while, the door opened and second Miss came out from inside. Her eyes suddenly widened. After a while, Li came out from inside with a sullen face, looked at Fang and said, Emingzu wrote the letter to me, not to Rui. Does it matter if she read it or not? Do you need to be so sneaky? Are you stupid? Son-in-law, can you read the letter from Princess Royal to second Miss? Can you not read the letter from Princess Royal to second Miss? Son-in-law, don't you know in your heart? Fang rolled his eyes, looked at Li Yi and asked, Son-in-law, who is stupid? After listening to Fang's words, Li Yi's heart suddenly sank. His IQ was even lower than Fang's. He couldn't read the letter that Emingzu wrote to Rui, but Rui couldn't not read the letter that Emingzu wrote to him. So no matter who the letter was written to, as long as it was written by Emingzu, he had to hide it from her secretly. Li Yi looked at Fang. Even he understood the logic, but he didn't think of it immediately. He suddenly felt an unprecedented heartache. There's another letter here. I forgot to give it to you just now. Fang took out another envelope from his sleeve and handed it to Li Yi. Li looked at him and asked, Whose is this? Fang shook his head and said, I don't know. There's no name on it. It was sent with the princess letter. Although there's no recipient, it's definitely for son-in-law. Li reached out to take it and he was stunned. The envelope was bulging, and it was thicker than the two scripts that Mississippi Lu had just taken away. Could it be that Li Xin had written the problems that he had encountered into a book? This D*Ned man, did he really think that he was Baidu? Even Baidu wasn't that convenient. There was no signature on the letter, but according to Li Xian's style of doing things, Li Yi felt that his guess was most likely correct. He instantly lost the urge to open the envelope. He put the envelope aside, looked at the bundle of hair in his hand and fell into deep thought. What did Emingzu mean by sending him a bundle of hair? Was it to congratulate him on getting rich in the new year, or was there something else? As for what Mississippi Lu said about being together forever, he didn't really believe it. This was something that only young girls would do. It was possible that Shanning would do it, but for Emingzu, what if that was what she meant? Li Yi couldn't figure it out no matter how he thought about it. He couldn't help but complain in his heart. What did she want to say? Couldn't she have written it more clearly? A woman's mind was the hardest to guess. Then he tore open the envelope on the table. Since he had nothing else to do, he would reluctantly solve two of Li Xian's problems. There was indeed a book in the envelope. To be precise, it was a thick book. The cover was blank and there were no words. Li Yi sat on the chair, crossed his legs and opened the first page. The handwriting on the paper was neat and beautiful, and it was pleasing to the eye. Sir, I thought for a long time and I still decided to write to you. Since he left the capital city, there was only one person who still called him sir. Seeing the first sentence, Li Yi put down his crossed legs and sat up straight. The relaxed expression on his face gradually became serious. Fang squatted at the side, glanced at him and quietly squatted a little further away. When Li Yi put the thick letter on the table, he moved a little further away and stopped at the door. A few days before I wrote to Sir, the plum blossoms in the cold mountain temple bloomed again. My royal sister took me to see it once. The people in the capital city all said that this was the year when the plum blossoms in the cold mountain temple bloomed the most. It's a pity that my painting isn't as good as Sir's. Otherwise, I could draw this year's plum blossoms and keep it for you to see when you come back. Her handwriting was neat from beginning to end, and it could be seen how serious she was when she wrote the letter. The letter was very long and trivial. On one page she would write how beautiful the plum blossoms in the cold mountain temple were, and on another page she would write about the death of the old man who bought candy figurines on the street, and she had been sad for a long time. On another page she would write about what she had seen in the academy, and at some point she would mention that she was now in charge of the women's union, and there were many things she didn't know how to do, and she was learning slowly. Li could feel her mood from her words, her joy, anger, sorrow, and joy, as if she were by his side. He held up the letter that could already be called a book, and carefully read word by word, line by line, and page by page. His eyebrows gradually relaxed, and a smile unconsciously appeared on his face. When Su Jing walked in from outside, he was stopped by Fang at the door. Fang looked back at the figure who had been sitting quietly in the courtyard for a long time, and whispered, "Don't disturb him." Chapter 1028. Squatting at the door, Fang glanced at Su Zheng, who was waiting there quietly, and said, "Old Su, why are you looking for the son-in-law? Tell me. Maybe I can think of a way so there's no need to trouble him. The son-in-law is busy all day, so it's better not to make trouble for him." Su Zheng just looked at him indifferently and said nothing. "Hey, why are you looking at me like that? Are you looking down on me?" Fang straightened up and looked at him with a slightly angry expression. "Although I'm not as smart as the son-in-law, I'm not far behind. Sometimes the son-in-law isn't as smart as me. Tell me what's the matter. I'll help you think of a way." Su Jing looked at him and said, "We have a goddess and a protector, and the other side also has a goddess and a protector. In terms of numbers, we don't have the advantage. Most of the captive believers are from the Qi kingdom, and many of them are unwilling to surrender." After saying that, he looked at Fang and asked, "What's your idea?" In Fang's eyes, there was no normal person in the holy religion except for the son-in-law and Miss Ruoqing. No, except for Miss Ruoqing there was no normal person. Including Su Zheng in front of him, no one knew what was going on in their minds. They were extremely paranoid and crazy. They were a group of lunatics. What could he do to a bunch of lunatics like this? Was he supposed to press their heads and make them submit to him? Seeing that Su Zheng was still looking at him, Fang glared at him and said, "What are you looking at me for?" Su Zheng said, "I'm waiting for your idea." "Why are you waiting for my idea? Whether they are willing to surrender or not, does it have anything to do with me?" Fang glanced at him and asked, "You still have to ask me this kind of question. What are you doing as a purple envoy?" Su Zheng was a very serious person. He looked at him and said, "You just said you could think of a way." Fang thought for a moment, then suddenly looked at him and asked, "How old are you this year?" Su Zheng looked at him and said, 28. "Do you have an in-laws?" Fang asked again. "No." Fang pointed at him and said somewhat exasperatedly, "You're already 28 years old and you're about to reach your 30s. You don't even have a wife. When I was 28, my son could already work in the fields. You don't want to pass on the incense to your Su family. What's the use of thinking about all this nonsense all day?" Su Zheng looked at him and asked, "What's the use of having a mother-in-law? Is it to be afraid like you?" When Li Yi walked out of the courtyard, he saw Fang lift Su Zheng up with one hand and was about to throw him into the lotus pond in front. "What are you doing?" Only when Fang heard the voice did he put Su Zheng down. Su Zheng straightened his collar, his expression unchanged as he said, "There are hundreds of believers who are still unwilling to surrender. Most of them are from the Qi kingdom. Our influence in the Qi kingdom is not as great as theirs." The holy religion was now clearly divided into two parts. One was the Qi kingdom branch with Taoist nun as its concubine, and the other was the Jing kingdom branch with Ruoqing as its concubine. The Taoist nun's influence in the Jing kingdom was not as great as that of Ruoqing, and Ruoqing's importance in the hearts of the believers in the Qi kingdom was not as great as that of Taoist nun. Now that there was a conflict between the two concubines and they needed to take sides, there would be two completely different choices. "I understand." Li Yi nodded and said, "You can go now. I have my own way of dealing with this matter." "Okay." Su Zheng cupped his hands in obeisance and simply turned to leave. Fang stared at Li Yi with wide eyes and asked curiously, "What is your way, son-in-law?" He really couldn't figure it out. They didn't want to believe him, so what could he do? Could the son-in-law control what they were thinking? According to his experience, when the son-in-law said he had a way, he really did have a way. This was different from him. It seemed that the son-in-law was indeed a little smarter than him. He had to face this fact. For Li Yi, the problem of the believers of the holy religion was not simple, but it was not difficult either. As long as he found the right problem and applied the right medicine, he would soon see results. At present, the first thing on his mind was the upcoming wedding. When the officials and nobles in the capital married concubines, they would quietly carry them into the house in a sedan chair. They wouldn't make too much of a fuss. At most, they would invite some relatives and friends to get together. Li Yi also didn't intend to make the whole Shuzhou bustling. He didn't intend to announce it with great fanfare, nor did he want to invite the officials of Shuzhou. Although he could receive a lot of gifts, did he care about these things? However, it couldn't be too simple. After all, for women this was one of the most important things in their lives. Whether it was Zuamo or Ruoqing, they couldn't be wronged. Of course, seriously speaking, this was also his first marriage, so he had to take it seriously if the last time he was knocked unconscious didn't count. He walked into the room. Rui was looking at the clothes in the wardrobe and worrying. Seeing him come in, she hurriedly pulled him over and asked, "Husband, what do you think I should wear on the day my two sisters marry?" Li Yi was dazzled by the clothes in her wardrobe and said, "My wife looks good in anything." Rui shook her head and said, "That won't do. I have to choose one." Li Yi closed the wardrobe, put his arm around her waist and said, "There's no need to choose. I've already chosen the clothes you want to wear on that day." "Which one?" Rui asked in confusion. Li Yi led her to the bed, opened a box at the head of the bed, and rummaged out a piece of clothing. He said, "Just wear this." Rui was stunned, and then she shook her head and said, "Don't talk nonsense, husband. How can I wear this? Because I haven't seen my wife in this dress." Li Yi put the wedding dress on the bed, held her in his arms and said, "Last time I got married in a daze. Later I thought about it. How can I be so careless about marriage? So this time I want to marry again." Li Yi looked at her and asked, "My wife, are you willing to marry again?" "Husband. Dwainer is already 2 years old." Rui looked at him with a red face and whispered, "If we do this, others will laugh. I'll see who dares to laugh." "No way." Li Yi moved closer to her ear, sucked her earlobe and asked softly, "Can I?" Rui's soft body collapsed in his arms and her cheeks were red. She said as if she was sleep-talking, "Yes." When Xiao Huan passed by the courtyard, she stopped and turned back to take a curious look. Why was the door of the young master and the young lady's room closed again? It was clearly open just now. When Li Yi walked into another small courtyard, Xiao Chui was playing happily under the sun with a prism. Among Xiao Huan, Xiao Zhu and Xiao Chui, she was the best at playing. She was the best at playing shuttlecock and she was also the best at playing kickboxing. She could even play more tricks than others. At this moment she was showing Fang the phenomenon of using a prism to make a rainbow under the sun. Fang was obviously not interested in making a rainbow. He squatted beside her and whispered, "Xiao Chui, I have something to discuss with you." "What's the matter, Uncle Fang?" Xiao Chui adjusted the angle of the prism and asked casually. Fang looked at her and said, "You see, you call Xiao Hong's sister and I call you Uncle Fang. Between these two, is there a gap in seniority?" Xiao Chui couldn't change the way she called him. This was a sore point in his heart. Other people wanted to raise their seniority, but he just wanted her to call him Big Brother Fang. Was this request too much? Xiao Chui raised her head and blinked her eyes. She asked, "What do you mean?" "You see, your Xiao Hong sister is with me now. We are of the same generation." Fang looked at her and said patiently, "You call me Uncle Fang and you call her Xiao Hong's sister. Is there a gap in seniority?" Xiao Chui thought about it and came to a realization. She nodded and said, "It seems so." She looked at Fang and said seriously, "I'm sorry, I won't call you that in the future." Lao Fang suddenly felt tears welling up in his eyes and his nose tingling. It had been 3 years, almost 3 years. She was finally enlightened. Xiao Chui looked at him and said sincerely, "Uncle Fang, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I'll call her Aunt Xiao Hong from now on." Seeing Fang standing there in a daze with tears in his eyes, Xiao Chui was startled and asked, Uncle Fang, what's wrong?" "It's nothing." Fang wiped his eyes and looked up at the sky. He said, "The sun today is a little poisonous. My eyes hurt and I'm tearing up." Xiao Chui looked up and said doubtfully, "The sun today is not poisonous." "Not poisonous?" Fang lowered his head and shook it. He said, "That's because I thought of my dead mother." "Ah?" Fang wiped his eyes and sighed. If she didn't die, she would be living a happy life now. Chapter 1029. Li Yi could see that Fang was a little confused. Otherwise, he would not have made such a helpless, pained and disheartened expression. Even when he thought of his mother who had died early before she could enjoy her happiness, he would not have been like this. "Miss and Sister Ruoqing are in the room. Son-in-law, you can go in by yourself." Xiao Chui continued to play with her prism. Since the matter with drunken Mo and Ruoqing was settled, she had changed the way she addressed herself. This was learned from Xiao Huan. Later Xiao Zhu also followed suit. Li Yi walked into the room. Xiao Chui had already made a rainbow. Looking at Fong, she said proudly, "Uncle Fong, look, isn't it beautiful? I can also use other methods to make a rainbow. Sister Xiao Chui?" Lao Fong looked at her and said seriously, "I'm calling you sister. Can you let me finish talking?" Xiao Chui put down the prism, shook her head and said shyly, "Uncle Fong, you are too polite. I am much younger than you." Drunken Mo and Ruoqing were both in the room. The two sat by the bed, on which there were two neatly arranged wedding dresses. Drunken Mo generously pointed to the bed and said, "Sister Ruoqing, which one do you want? Take your pick." Ruoqing looked at her and said doubtfully, "But you embroidered all these." Drunken Mo frowned and said, "So what if I embroidered it? Didn't I say long ago that my things are your things? Why do we need to separate yours and mine?" Li stood behind them and asked, "What about me?" "You." Drunken Mo looked back, rolled her eyes at him and said, "You are not a thing." Li did not know whether she was saying that he was good or bad, so he was pushed out by her. Drunken Mo pushed him out of the door and said, "I am discussing an important matter with Sister Ruoqing. You can come in later." Looking at the closed door, Li shook his head. Wasn't it just discussing who was going to wear which wedding dress? Was there any difference? So what if she wore it? When the time came, she would still have to take it off. He walked to the side and decided to watch Emerald perform her magic for a while. Using a Mitsubishi mirror to create a rainbow was the most basic. Advanced players like Emerald had already mastered the method of creating a rainbow. As long as the weather was right, they could create a rainbow using a homemade sprayer, a basin of water, and a mirror. In the room, Drunk Ink looked at Ruoqing and said, "Although you didn't embroider it yourself, there's no time to embroider it now. Fortunately, I'm thoughtful. Just make do with it, don't bother about these things." Ruoqing shook her head and said, "I'm not fussing over it. You know, it's not easy for me to wear this dress. I know you're the Empress. You can't let them see the Empress wearing a wedding dress." Drunk Ink looked at her and asked, "But do you think they will let you wear a wedding dress?" Hearing this, Ruoqing blushed inexplicably and whispered, "I can wear it in private." "You don't need to wear it in private." Drunk Ink pressed her shoulder and let her sit on the bed. "You don't have to worry about these things. Who cares about the Empress? You just have to be your bride in peace." She took off her shoes and socks and jumped onto the bed. "Don't hesitate. Put it on first. This is the first time in my life that I'm wearing a wedding dress." Ruoqing had no choice but to agree. Soon, in the room, in front of a dressing mirror that was as tall as a person, there were two more brides. Both of them were already very beautiful, and now that they were wearing wedding dresses, it added a bit of soul-stirring charm. Drunk Ink looked at the mirror for a long time before snorting softly. That guy got lucky. When she and Ruoqing sat back on the bed, she seemed to think of something and suddenly looked at Ruoqing. "What's wrong?" Ruoqing was a little confused by her gaze and looked at her. Drunk Ink was startled and suddenly asked, "Although we married at the same time, there has to be a sequence. Tell me who came first and who came last." "Of course it's you first." There was no need to hesitate on this question. To be exact, it was Drunk Ink who met him first and they were also together first. "I'll go first." Drunk Ink suddenly revealed an inexplicable smile on her face. She looked at her and asked, "Then does little Ruoqing have to call me big sister?" Ruoqing looked up at her and finally seemed to understand something, and her face became even redder. "Ah." Drunk Ink couldn't help but laugh heartily and pushed her down on the bed. "I've called you big sister for more than 10 years, and now I can finally turn things around. Little Ruoqing, quickly call me big sister." Ruoqing's face was crimson and she gritted her teeth. "No." Drunk Ink snorted coldly. "No, if you don't blame me for punishing you. Does anyone need my help?" Li stood by the window and asked as he watched the two people rolling on the bed. Whether it was to help Ruoqing resist Drunk Ink or to help Drunk Ink punish Ruoqing, he could help. Bang. Looking at the tightly closed window, Li shook his head and turned to walk back to the yard. Drunk Ink and Ruoqing didn't bring him out, Rui and Emingzi didn't bring him out, Rui and Xiaohuan didn't bring him out for a bath, and he actually degenerated to watch Xiao Chui turn into a rainbow with Fong. The Shu King's mansion. The Shu King's mansion was no longer the Shu King's mansion. At best, it could only be called the former site of the Shu King's mansion. In a spacious hall, the door was closed and the windows were closed from the outside. Hundreds of people were crowded in the hall, and most of them sat quietly on the ground, expressionless. "Envoy Su, don't waste your effort anymore." The person sitting at the very front opened his eyes and looked at the young man standing in front of him. He said, "I'll also give you a piece of advice. You and I shouldn't interfere in the affairs of the two goddesses. Otherwise, we'll be punished by the gods and die without a burial place. Fang, who was leaning against the pillar, curled his lips. What *t divine punishment, that could make people die without a burial place? That was called divine punishment. Su Zheng looked at him and said lightly, Envoy Fang of the right betrayed us and wanted to harm the concubines. You are also guilty. Although the concubines don't want to blame you if you continue to be stubborn, don't blame me for not being polite. There's no point in saying more. We will not interfere in the affairs of the two concubines, the man said lightly and closed his eyes again. Su Zheng clenched his fists tightly, but he quickly relaxed them. Although the believers of the two countries had already accepted the fact that there were two concubines in the holy religion, and the believers of the Jing kingdom had all been subdued by him, it was not easy for the people of the Qi kingdom to determine who was superior between the two concubines. The concubines have arrived. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded from outside the hall. In the hall, after a brief silence, everyone stood up from the ground. A young woman appeared at the door of the hall. All the believers of the holy religion knew that the Empress had two incarnations in the human world, and they also remembered the portraits of the two concubines in their hearts. The woman standing outside the door was one of the concubines, the one who represented benevolence. Greetings, concubine. Under the lead of the leader, everyone bowed to the woman at the door. No need to stand on ceremony, the woman said softly. Thank you, concubine. They looked up and saw a rainbow-colored ray of light behind the concubine. It wasn't just one but several dozens. The Empress was draped in rainbows and behind her were countless rays of light. Like a goddess, Wanru appeared in front of them. Inside the hall, all the believers were dumbfounded. Old Fang froze on the spot, pursed his lips, nudged Su Zheng who was standing on the side and asked, That, your other queen, can she glow? Greetings, concubine. Su Zheng didn't answer him, instead kneeling down on both knees, prostrating himself on the ground and loudly said, Greetings, concubine. All the believers in the hall knelt down at the same time, prostrating themselves on the ground. This was the highest form of etiquette of the holy religion. Just now, they were greeting the incarnation of the Empress Benevolence. Now they were greeting the real Empress. And the reason why they could distinguish whether the concubine in front of them was the concubine or her incarnation was because the concubine's incarnation didn't glow, nor did it emit rainbow-colored rays of light. This was the arrival of the Empress herself. Chapter 1030. Ruoqing was like an immortal. She came in a rainbow and left in a rainbow. With a wave of her sleeves, she didn't take away a single cloud, but she took away the faith of many believers. Ruoqing took away their faith and Su Zheng took away their bodies. These were the first batch of believers of the Qi kingdom that they had subdued, and they were the core elites of the holy religion in the Qi kingdom. These elites all prostrated before Xiao Chui's prism. Li Yi had always felt that compared to all kinds of people in the world, these fanatics were the simplest and purest. They wouldn't scheme against each other and dealing with them wasn't tiring at all. They only believed in Her Majesty. If Her Majesty wanted them to do evil, they would do evil. If Her Majesty wanted them to do good, they would do good. If they could be guided and purified compared to the filthy and chaotic court, they would be a clean stream in the world. Xiao Chui put away her prism, picked up the mirror in the water, and took away the basin of water in the courtyard. 4 high-level players, these things and 2 assistants were enough to give people a feast for the eyes. After the matter was done, she would leave in a flash, hiding her achievements and fame. Of course, she didn't really leave in a flash. She just went to the mall with Xiao Zhu and Xiao Huan. Today they could bring back everything that they could bring back. Li Yi felt that it was necessary to discuss with Ruoqing and give her the title of Rainbow Saintess. Not to mention other things, just her ability of rainbow in daylight was enough for her to establish her own faction. After today, the historical problems of Shu province were almost all solved. Li Yi could wait for his 2-3 Shaonyang sons to marry into his family. Thinking about it carefully, there didn't seem to be a big enough bed at home. Today he would ask Uncle Han to make one for him. In the depths of the land of Bedlam, somewhere deep in the mountains, 3 wretched figures came out of the woods. When they stood on a wide mountain road, they couldn't help but burst into laughter. These 3 people were naturally the right custodian of the holy religion, Fang Yu, and the 2 purple-clothed messengers. Since that night they had been on the run for more than a month. That day they were chased by dozens of experts. They only cared about running for their lives and lost their direction. They wandered around the mountains like headless flies, eating and sleeping in the open, cutting their way through brambles and thorns and finally found the right path. They had suffered quite a lot along the way. At that moment, Fang Yu's clothes had been torn into rags, his face was covered in dirt, and his hair was stuck together. The two purple-robed envoys beside him were not in a better condition, and even appeared to be in a worse state. One looked at him and asked in a hoarse voice, "Guardian, where are we going now?" "Although it is wrong," Fang Custodian and said. Fang Yu looked ahead, gritted his teeth and said, "Let's go to Qi Kingdom first and meet up with Her Highness. When we're done with Qi Kingdom, we'll come back and kill Li Yi and those Baldies." This time he fell into the Baldies' trap. Not only did he fail to capture Li Yi, but he also almost lost his life. The elites of the holy religion under his command would not have a good ending if they fell into the Baldies' hands. With such a huge loss, he even lost his base in the land of Bedlam. When he returned to the Qi Kingdom, he would most likely be punished by Saintis. But he didn't have to worry too much. Blood was thicker than water. No matter how angry Saintis was, she wouldn't do anything to him. But he couldn't swallow the anger in his heart. If things in the Qi Kingdom could proceed smoothly, such a small loss would not be a big deal. He heaved a long sigh of relief. As long as Saintis was there, everything would be fine. He really didn't want to face Li Yi alone. The most important thing now was to find a few suitable clothes. "The three of you stop." A loud and clear voice suddenly came from behind. A few figures quickly rushed out of the forest and surrounded them. The fierce-looking man who led the group looked at them and said, "This is a robbery. Hand over all your valuables. If I'm in a good mood, I might let you go." As he spoke, his voice trailed off. Because the three people before him were really too shabby, their faces were covered in dirt. Not to mention that they hadn't washed their faces for a long time, their clothes had long been torn into rags. They couldn't even cover their crotch. He really couldn't figure out where else they could hide their valuables. The fierce man looked at them, waved his hand impatiently and said, "Forget it, I'm unlucky to have met you three paupers. It's really unlucky. I'll let you go today. Get out of here." Fang Yu didn't leave. He was staring at the leader's bald head in a daze. When he saw this bald head, Wang Wei's hateful face would appear in his mind. Since more than a month ago, what he hated the most in his heart had changed from wasting food to bald heads. The fierce-looking man looked at them and asked, "Are you deaf? Didn't you hear what I said?" Fang Yu looked at him again and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Ha, bald head." This was already the territory of the Qi Kingdom. No matter how fast those bald heads were, they couldn't have come here. So the bald head in front of him was definitely not the bald head he hated. But they were all bald. For some reason, the fierce-looking bald man suddenly felt cold all over and inexplicably shivered. Fang Yu and the two purple-robed envoys began to walk in the direction of those people. "What do you want?" "You're courting death." "You, why are you taking off my clothes?" Don't, big brother, you're a hero." "You can have the socks, but can you leave a crotch cloth?" "It's cold, leave a pair of pants for me to wear." "I beg you, big brother." After only a quarter of an hour, the mountain path was littered with the bodies of the three people, but there was no sign of them. The leader of the bald men had long been beaten black and blue and his face was swollen beyond recognition. He lay limp on the ground, his body twitching unconsciously. Although the others did not suffer the same torture as him, there were three of them who were naked from head to toe. They didn't even have a crotch cloth. They squatted down, crossed their arms, and looked at their companions beside them, shivering. "Borrow a pair of pants to wear. We're all brothers, don't be so stingy. If you don't have pants, socks will do." The capital city. The king of Shu was captured by Jianghu of Silla in Shuzhou and was now secretly escorted to the capital city. Apart from the royal family and some high-ranking officials in the court, the people and officials in the capital city were still in the dark about this matter. After all, the matter of the Cui clan was no small matter. It was equivalent to treason. Although this matter had passed for a long time, it was related to the royal family. Once the king of Shu returned, it would definitely become the focus of the people and officials in the capital city. At the gate of the palace, a eunuch who had already received the news stood quietly and waited. He didn't know when, but a carriage appeared in front of him. The carriage came from afar and slowly stopped. The carriage looked very shabby. Obviously, it had been traveling for a long time. A young man jumped out of the carriage and lifted the curtain, showing it to a eunuch in the palace. The eunuch asked, "Look, is this the king of Shu?" The eunuch looked at it carefully and compared it with the portrait in his hand. He nodded and said, "Without a doubt, it is the king of Shu. It's good that it is the king of Shu." The young man took the book and pen and handed it to the eunuch. He said, If there is no problem with the goods, please sign here. Thank you for your hard work, brother. The eunuch cupped his hands and said with a smile. In order to deceive the public, it was not a courier who secretly escorted the king of Shu from Shuzhou to the capital city, but an armed escort. This Shunfeng escort agency had just been established, but its branches had already spread across all the provinces and prefectures of the Jing kingdom. Whether it was delivering letters or goods, the speed of logistics was only inferior to the speed of the imperial court's express delivery. Moreover, it was very credible and rarely made mistakes. Although it was more expensive, it was still very popular among the people and merchants. The eunuch was already familiar with this. He took the pen and paper and said, "Please wait here for a moment. I will bring it back to His Majesty and have him sign it." Chapter 1031. Not long after, in the Hall of Diligent Government, Li Xian, who had just returned from the Academy of Sciences, signed a piece of paper and asked, "Where is the king of Shu now?" The eunuch replied, "The princess has temporarily sent him to Jianghu Palace." Li Xian walked out of the hall and walked into a palace. He stood side by side with Emingzu. The king of Shu was not the real king of Shu, but this news could not be spread out. Otherwise, it would damage his father's reputation. Even his return to the capital had to be done quietly so as not to attract the attention of the people and officials. This was the reason why Li Yi chose to secretly send the king of Shu back without fanfare. Inside the hall, the king of Shu looked at the eunuchs and palace maids in front of him and laughed. "I thought that Li Yi was here to steal my throne. It turns out that he wants to send me back." He pointed to the people in front of him and said, "Slaves, why don't you kneel when you see me?" The eunuchs and palace maids lowered their heads and did not dare to speak. He walked around the hall and saw Li Xian and Emingzu standing at the door. He pointed at them and asked, "Li Xian and Emingzu, why don't you bow to me when you see me? Have you forgotten the rules I taught you?" Li Xian looked at him and turned to ask, "Are you crazy?" Emingzu shook her head. "I don't know." Li Xian thought for a moment and waved his hand. "Forget it, it's not important." He looked behind him and said to a eunuch, "Someone bring wine." "Yes, your majesty." Soon a eunuch came out with an exquisite wine pot. Li Xian poured a cup of wine and handed it to the king of Shu. He said lightly, "Drink it." The king of Shu was stunned and shook his head violently. "I don't drink. Drinking will cause trouble. I don't drink. I like to drink grape wine." Li Xian thought for a moment and turned back. "Bring me grape wine." The king of Shu was clearly taken aback. Then he shook his head and said, "I don't drink grape wine. I want to drink water." "Water is good for the body." Li Xian asked the eunuch to bring 3 cups to the king of Shu. He pointed to the tray and said, "This cup is wine, this cup is grape wine, and this cup is water. There must be one that you like, right?" "I don't drink wine, nor do I drink grape wine, nor do I drink water." The king of Shu suddenly waved his hand and knocked the tray over. He stretched out his hands and began to run in the hall. As he ran he shouted, "I am the Son of Heaven, I am the God of Heaven. I don't need to eat, I don't need to drink. I can absorb the spiritual chi of heaven and earth and the essence of the sun and moon." Li Xian looked at the eunuchs and palace maids beside him and said, "You can leave first." "Yes." The few of them quickly retreated and closed the door. Only then did Li Xian look at the king of Shu who was letting loose in the hall. He asked, "Are you done acting?" "Aye. If you say another word, I won't let them send you food or water in the future. Anyway, you can absorb the spiritual chi of heaven and earth and the essence of the sun and moon. You won't starve to death." The king of Shu stopped in his tracks and turned back to look at them. He smiled bitterly and said, "You've won, you've won. You've won the world, won the hearts of the people, won everything. Let me go, I don't want to die, I don't want to die." Li Xian looked at him and asked, "Who wants you to die?" The king of Shu pointed to the mess on the ground and said repeatedly, "Poisoned wine, you want me to drink poisoned wine?" Li Xian took out the wine pot from another tray, took a sip, poured a cup of grape wine and drank it in one gulp. Finally, he rinsed his mouth with water from another pot, looked at the king of Shu and said, "Long time no see. I'm just treating you to a cup of wine. Why are you so nervous?" The king of Shu collapsed to the ground and looked at Li Xian in despair. He asked, "Li Xian, what grudge do you have against me? You stole my princess and my throne, and now you want to treat me like this. Have you forgotten?" Li Xian looked at him and said fiercely, "How can you forget? Have you forgotten that you bullied me when I was a child? You bullied me so badly. At that time I thought, don't fall into my hands in the future. Not long after, Li Xian walked out of the palace and said to the 2 imperial guards at the door, "From today on, seal up Jinghe Palace. He is not allowed to step out. Except for food and water every day, no one is allowed to enter." "Yes, your majesty." When he walked back, Li Xian turned to look at Emingzu and asked, "Is there anything wrong with dealing with him like this?" Emingzu did not speak, which meant that she acquiesced. In the blink of an eye, that guy has been gone for almost a year. The last time he sent a letter saying that he was going to get married soon and that he was going to marry 2 wives. It seems to be in the next 2 days. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see it. Li Xian put his hands behind his head, stretched, and said, "Why don't we go to Shuzhou to see the suffering of the people and have a nuptial night?" But it may be too late. Before he finished speaking, he felt that it was inappropriate. He turned to look at Emingzu and immediately changed the topic. "Let's not talk about this. Emingzu, look how blue the sky is today and how white the clouds are." As he spoke, his voice became lower. He looked at her in confusion, pointed to her hair and asked, "What's wrong with your hair? It seems to be missing." "It's nothing." She covered the strand of hair with her hand and said, "I accidentally cut it when I was practicing swordsmanship." Looking at Emingzu, who left in a hurry, Li Xian shook his head and said, "When you practice swordsmanship, you should tie up your hair." Speaking of hair, he lowered his head and touched a sachet on his waist. There were 2 strands of hair in it, one was Qin'er's and the other was Susu's. He suddenly looked up at the direction in which Emingzu had left, and a look of realization appeared on his face. He murmured, "Has it come to this?" According to the customs of the Jing kingdom, the wedding was divided into 6 steps. Accepting gifts, asking for names, accepting gifts, asking for dates, and welcoming in person. But when it came to Li Yi, everything was simple. Ruoqing and Zuemo were already a family. It was not known whether and Rui could be counted as a second marriage. They were just married from one yard to another. The journey to Shuzhou was long, and it was difficult for the old lady to bear the long journey. From the few words in the letter, one could see the old lady's regret. As the governor of the capital and the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Zheng Shichen was busy with official affairs. It was impossible for him to leave the capital for several months, so he sent gifts and letters very early. Ruoqing became an orphan at a very young age and grew up in a brothel. She had no relatives, so many customs and steps of the wedding could be skipped directly. Of course, it was impossible for the 4 of them to not have an elder. Second uncle sat at the front with his eyes half closed. After receiving their greetings, he lowered his head and let out a light snore. Tonight, the Jianghu of Sila's mansion was particularly lively. Li did not make a big fuss at the wedding. Everything was carried out in the mansion in a low-key manner. Although the people and officials of Shuzhou had known the news a long time ago, they did not know that the day of His Highness Jianghu of Sila's wedding was today. Of course, even so, there were a lot of guests in the mansion. There were people from the Lu League, people from the brothel, the bald group led by Wang Wei, and people from the Willow Leaf village who had gone through thick and thin together from the beginning. Tonight, there was no prince or son-in-law, only men and wine. Li Yi raised his wine cup, raised his head frequently, and drank up all the wine in the cup. Fortunately, he was good at drinking, so he would not get drunk after 2 or 3 cups. Moreover, in order not to delay the wedding night, his wine was made by Xiao Zhu herself. There was a strong smell of wine, but in fact the alcohol content was not high, only a little higher than grape wine, so it was not easy to get drunk. Xiao Zhu decided to carry forward her bartending business, and Li Yi strongly supported her. He just promised her that he would open a tavern in Yong County in a few days and let her be the proprietress. He did not know whether her tears were because of this or because she was reluctant to see her miss get married. Maybe the latter reason was more because Xiao Cui, who was with her, also had tears in her eyes. This was a little strange. The wedding with Ruoqing and Zumo was just a ceremony. They would be the same as before, so why were they crying? What was more strange was that Xiao Huan also cried, and she cried even more sadly than them. Her tears could not be stopped. She was already an 18-year-old girl, but why did she still cry like a little girl? Chapter 1032. Tonight, the Jianghu of Silla residence was filled with jubilation. Wang Wei had drunk a lot that night. His face was red and he couldn't even speak properly. He only knew how to raise his glass and said, "Come, come, come, your highness, drink." Fang rubbed his bald head and glared at him. He said, "What are you drinking for? If you want to drink, go home with your wife." Didn't you see how much the son-in-law drank tonight? Wang Wei pushed him away. His eyes were drunk and blurred. He said, "No, this glass of wine? I must toast your highness with this glass of wine. My life was given by your highness and big sister. I can get to where I am today thanks to your highness' trust. I have no regrets in this life if I can work for your highness." Fang carried him to a bald woman and said, "Sister-in-law, I'll leave this guy to you. In the future, persuade him to drink less. He won't be able to control himself if he drinks too much. Just now, I saw him groping a little girl who was serving wine. He wanted the little girl to be his concubine. The little girl was so anxious that she cried, 'Got it?'" The bald woman nodded. She held Wang Wei's neck with one hand and looked at him coldly. Fang looked at the time and walked to the front. He said loudly, "It's getting late. Everyone should have eaten and drunk enough. Let's go," a drunk man said in a daze. "Hey, it's still early. We haven't consummated our marriage." Fang kicked his butt and said angrily, "Get out, get out. If you've drunk enough, get out. Don't cause trouble here." Li waved his hand and said, "If they want to drink, let them continue to drink. There's enough wine today. They can drink as much as they want." Fang looked back and nodded. "Then let them drink here. I'll help son-in-law to rest. No need." Li waved his hand. "I'm not drunk yet. I can walk by myself." His body swayed and he walked outside alone. Fang followed behind and watched him walk into a courtyard. Then he turned and left. Li closed the door and blocked out all the noise outside. The whole world suddenly became quiet. Several rooms in the courtyard were lit up. Li took a few steps forward. When he was about to step on the stairs, he suddenly didn't know which one to push. He stood where he was and thought for a moment. Then he stretched out his finger and muttered, "Pick an army, pick a general, pick a wife. Whoever little rooster points at will be the one." Li Yi's finger moved slowly, and he nodded every time he pointed. When he said, "Who," for the second time, his finger pointed at the room on the far left. The room on the far right belonged to Rui. From right to left it was Ruoqing, Zuemo and Rui. Today was their wedding night. It was not good to choose between Rui, Ruoqing and Zuemo. It was unrealistic to choose all of them, so they could only follow God's will. Li Yi walked up the stairs to the door of the leftmost room. Halfway there he stopped. Rui God's will told him to choose Rui, but he didn't dare to. He knew which one he couldn't afford to offend, God's will or Rui. So this time he had to go against God's will. He stretched out his finger again and changed the direction. He nodded and said, "Whoever little rooster points at will be the one." His finger still stopped at the room on the far left. Li put down his finger and thought to himself, would there be retribution for disobeying God's will twice in a row? Disobeying might not necessarily happen, but not disobeying it would happen immediately. Li Yi excluded Rui's room and chose a new one. This time he could finally follow God's will. He walked to the door of Rui's room and knocked on the door. The candlelight in the room that was still lit a moment ago was extinguished in the next moment. Rui's voice came from inside. "Tonight I will sleep with Xiaohuan. Husband, go find little sisters Ruoqing and Zuemo." Although he didn't want to disobey God's will, Li Yi had no choice but to give up after knocking a few times and there was no response. He knew why Rui did this and he was a little touched. There was only one Rui in the world and it was his Rui. He didn't save the world in his previous life, and he was kicked because he was willing to help others. This must be God's compensation for him. As for that bastard who returned kindness with enmity, he couldn't take revenge for this kick in this life, but in the next life he would harm his daughter and let him get what he wanted. Li Yi walked to the door of Ruoqing's room and knocked on the door. This time the candlelight in the room was extinguished after a while. Ruoqing stood on the opposite side of the door and said to him, "Tonight I will sleep with Xiao Zhu. You go find sister Rui and Zuemo." There weren't many women as sensible as Rui, and with the addition of Ruoqing, God's compensation for him was too great. Could be seen how much that guy hurt him. In the next life, if it was not enough to have sex with one daughter, he would at least have sex with two. Li Yi stood outside Ruoqing's door for a while before walking to the door of Zuemo's. His footsteps stopped and the candlelight in the room went out. Li Yi was startled and asked, "Do you want to say that you want to sleep with Xiao Chui tonight and ask me to find Rui and Ruoqing?" Not saying anything was a tacit agreement. Li Yi knew that Zuemo was just a door away and whispered, "Don't make trouble." "I'm not making trouble." Zuemo leaned against the door and whispered, "Anyway, tonight you can't find me." Li Yi understood what she meant, and he also understood what Rui and Ruoqing meant. However, what was wrong with sleeping with Xiaohuan, Xiao Zhu and Xiao Chui? The bed was a new big bed and it was not crowded for 3 people. He had 3 beautiful wives but he could only stay alone. This was one of the saddest things in life. On the wedding night, where to sleep at night was actually a problem. There was no bed in the study. Should he squeeze with Fong? He sat on the steps, leaning against the pillar, drowsy. Although the wine he drank at night was specially made by Xiao Zhu, it was still wine after all. After drinking too much, he still felt a little dizzy. But what Rui and the others did, the cold wind at night and the cold stone steps, made his heart and body cold and his buttocks cold and he couldn't sleep. He shivered slightly and a fragrant wind blew and suddenly he felt a lot warmer. Because he had a piece of clothing on his shoulders. "It's cold outside, come in," Mississippi Lu said lightly, turned around and walked into the room. On the wedding night he was locked out by his wife, and was seen by his sister-in-law. This made Li Yi blush a little. This was really embarrassing. He was already familiar with Mississippi Lu's room, even more familiar than his own room. This room carried many painful memories that he didn't want to recall. Li Yi wrapped his clothes tightly, and when he stepped into the room, he seemed to hear the sound of smacking echoing in his ears. Mississippi Lu poured a cup of hot tea for him and sat across from him, minding her own business. Li Yi drank a cup of tea and then he realized that there was not only tea on the table, but also wine and dishes. Grumble? His stomach began to growl in disappointment. Just now, it was only at the beginning and then he only cared about drinking. Now that he smelled the aroma, he felt unbearably hungry. He licked his lips, picked up the chopsticks on the table and began to wolf down the food. Mississippi Lu glanced at him and reminded him, "These are my chopsticks." Li Yi curled his lips and said, "Don't be so stingy. If you want to eat, then get another pair. We're a family, why bother about these things?" Mississippi Lu reminded him again, "Those are the chopsticks I used just now." Okay, I'll give them back to you." Li Yi took a few more mouthfuls of food, returned the chopsticks to her and said, "Then get me a new pair." Mississippi Lu took a new pair of chopsticks, but it was not for Li Yi, and she ate while drinking. Women were really strange creatures. One moment they wanted it, the next moment they didn't. Li Yi shook his head and poured himself a cup. Tonight, in order not to affect the wedding night, Li Yi asked Xiao Zhu to make a few pots of wine for him. Now that the wedding night was over, he should drink to his heart's content on this big day. He looked at Rui opposite him and thought to himself, God's will is God's will. After going around in a big circle, in the end he still had to spend the wedding night with Rui. On both sides of the square table, one was dressed in white and the other was dressed in red, but there seemed to be no conflict between them. The atmosphere was extremely harmonious, as if everything was supposed to be like this. Once you drink too much, you can't control your mouth. What's more, today was a good day. Once people had a good life, they would always think about better things. It was better to add flowers to a brocade than to add snow to snow. Li looked at Rui and suddenly said, "Rui, let's discuss something." Mississippi Lu looked up at him and asked, "What is it?" Li thought for a moment and said, "In the future, can you be gentler to me? Don't spank my butt anymore." Mississippi Lu thought for a moment, looked at him and asked, "Then will you still be so naughty in the future?" Chapter 1033. Li looked at Mississippi Lu with a troubled expression and said, I'll try my best." Mississippi Lu nodded and said, "Then I'll try my best too." "You can't try your best." Li drank another glass of wine to boost his courage and said, "You see, I'm a prince now and I have so many people under me. I also want my face. If you keep hitting me like this and others see it, how can I show my authority?" Mississippi Lu didn't say anything. She just looked at the wedding robe draped over his shoulder. The red was a little dazzling. She smiled and nodded, "Okay. Then it's a deal." Li's face lit up with joy and stretched out his finger, "Pinky swear." "Childish?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him, then stretched out her little finger and hooked it together with her thumb. "That's a deal. If you go back on your word, you'll suffer retribution. Be careful that you won't be able to marry for the rest of your life." Li was overjoyed. He filled her cup with wine and said, "Drink. Let's drink to our vow. This glass is for today's big day. This glass is for capturing me up the mountain. This glass is for the king of bandits." Li didn't know how much Mississippi Lu could drink. He only remembered that at the beginning she would get drunk and blush when she drank the tasteless liquor. That was the only time he saw her drunk. Today was the second time. Li didn't know what time it was. The dishes were gone and the table was filled with empty wine jars. Li Yi felt like the world was spinning around him, but he refilled their glasses out of habit. He put his hand on her shoulder and said, "This cup is for you being a man." Mississippi Lu's eyes were blurred. She waved her hand and said, "No, I'll be drunk if I drink any more." "It's okay, you can't drink, I'll drink for you." Li Yi drank both glasses of wine. Mississippi Lu's cheeks were red and she frowned. "I can't drink? What a joke, bring the wine." "There's no more." Li Yi took a few empty wine jars and shook his head. He put the wine jars back and turned around. He found Mississippi Lu sitting at the table, holding her cheek with one hand and looking at him with blurred eyes. Li Yi was startled and said, "I'll be embarrassed if you look at me like this." She looked for a long time and suddenly said, "Let me ask you a question." Li Yi sat down beside her and asked, "What is it?" "Who's prettier, Emingzi and Li?" "You too." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "I don't know who's prettier." "You don't know?" Lady Lu's voice rose a pitch. "It's okay." Li Yi waved his hand, patted her chest and said, "Although the two of you are about the same beauty, your breasts are bigger than hers. She definitely won't be able to catch up in this lifetime." "It's okay?" Li Yi waved his hand. He patted her chest and said, "You asked first." Unexpectedly, Mississippi Lu just waved her hand casually and said, "Forget it." "It's not the first time anyway." However, Miss Lu just casually waved her hand and said, "Forget it." "It's not the first time anyway." Li Yi looked at her and murmured, "Not the first time?" She didn't explain further and picked up a wine pot. However, she didn't pour any wine out. She stood up and walked towards the bed unsteadily, saying, "You can go back. I'm tired. I want to sleep." "They don't want you and I don't want you." Mississippi Lu grabbed his arm and said, "You should go back." "I'm sleepy. I want to sleep." "They don't want you and I don't want you." Mississippi Lu grabbed his arm and said, "Get up." Li Yi suddenly opened his eyes. He looked at her and asked, "You don't want me either?" Mississippi Lu stood by the bed and stared at him. After a while, she rolled him to the foot of the bed. "Yes." She lay down beside him and said, "They don't want you, but I want you." She turned around and looked at Li Yi. "I have one more question." Li Yi closed his eyes and murmured, "Why do you have so many questions? Are you asking 100,000 whys? Do you still want to go back?" "Go back to where?" "Go back to where you came from." "Yes." Li Yi opened his eyes. His gaze was blurry. He said, "Even in my dreams?" Mississippi Lu's eyelashes fluttered. She looked confused and asked, "Don't you want everything here? Don't you want my sister? Don't you want Duaner? Don't you want Xiao Huan? Don't you want Yong Ning? Don't you want Emingzu? Don't you want me?" "Yes, I want everything." "Then why do you still want to go back?" "I miss my mother." After a moment of silence, Mississippi Lu stretched out her hand and slapped his butt through the quilt. She said angrily, "Why didn't you say so earlier?" Li Yi's hands were rolled up in the quilt. He couldn't move. He squirmed a few times and said, "We just made a pinky promise." "You still hit me. Be careful. No one wants you in the future." "If no one wants you, then no one wants you." Li Yi suddenly laughed. "Ah, don't worry. If no one wants you in the future, don't forget about me. Don't forget about you. You don't want me either. You've already used this trick. Don't forget about me. I'll support you." Her raised hand fell down again. Her eyelashes fluttered a few times. After a long time she said slowly, "I'm sleepy." This time she didn't get any response. She opened her eyes and looked at him in his sleep. There was still a smile on her face. Her breathing gradually calmed down. She just stared. When Li Yi woke up, he found that he had a terrible headache. He thought that Mississippi Lu must have made him drunk again last night. He opened his eyes and wanted to get up from the bed, only to find that he couldn't get up at all. He was rolled up in the quilt. The culprit was sleeping next to him. She was sound asleep and hadn't woken up yet. The person lying next to his pillow was actually Mississippi Lu. This gave Li Yi a fright. But looking at the situation now, they should just be lying on the same bed. Nothing serious happened. Only then did he finally relax. He spent a lot of effort to get out of the quilt. He carefully got off the bed and looked back. Mississippi Lu was still asleep. "What a pig," Li Yi shook his head. When he was about to leave, he suddenly turned around after taking 2 steps. He stared blankly at the figure on the bed. Mississippi Lu. The sleeping Mississippi Lu. The defenseless Mississippi Lu. She slept soundly on her side. Her back was facing Li Yi. A certain perky part of her was facing him. Li Yi's gaze fell on that part of Mississippi Lu's body. A bold idea suddenly popped up in his mind. What goes around comes around. This year it's my turn. Sooner or later you'll have to pay for what you've done. Pay them back in their own coin. It's never too late for a gentleman to take revenge. At this moment he thought of many words from the ancients. The ancients didn't lie to me. Countless painful memories emerged in his heart. Li Yi raised his head and hit her without hesitation. Smack. Li Yi swore that this was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. All the humiliation he had suffered in the past disappeared in this smack. At this moment he felt that he had reached the peak of his life. Then he saw Mississippi Lu turn her head and look at him with a pair of deep eyes. The sky was slightly bright. Fong came out of the courtyard. He opened the door and stretched his body. Bang! In the prince's mansion, one of the courtyard doors suddenly shattered. Two figures jumped out one after another. Fong's expression changed. Did assassins break into the residence of eldest miss and second miss? Soon he dispelled this thought. Because the people who came out one after another were the son-in-law and second Mississippi. The next moment his expression became even more horrified. Because he realized that the son-in-law was wearing second Miss's clothes early in the morning. Moreover, both of them were barefooted. His body shuddered as he immediately thought of a terrifying possibility. Could it be that the son-in-law was drunk last night and went into the wrong room? On the wedding night he went into the wrong room and slept on the wrong bed? Or perhaps he slept with the wrong person? Help! Someone's been killed. He looked in the direction of the scream in a daze and sighed. What a sin. Chapter 1034. Li Yi sat in the yard and spent a long time to calm down. He had once reached the peak of his life. Although it was very short and fleeting, he would always remember the feeling at that time. After being humiliated by Mississippi Lu for so long, at that moment he finally completed a beautiful counterattack. Of course it felt good, but the price he paid was painful. He was chased by Mississippi Lu for a few miles. This time she did not spank his butt again, but directly hit his laughing acupuncture point. When the two of them walked back, she looked at him and smiled all the way. However, it was not without gains. Li Yi still vaguely remembered that before the two of them got drunk last night, he seemed to have reached an agreement with her. She promised him that they would hook up. Although she was still not that gentle to him, at least she would not do something as shameful and exciting as spanking his butt. This was a great improvement and it was worth being happy about. The smile on Li Yi's face just appeared on his face, but he immediately stopped. He held his stomach and his face twitched. He laughed for too long in the morning, and now his stomach hurt when he laughed. Although he did not know what happened after that and why he ran to Mississippi Lu's bed, this was not important. Anyway, nothing that should not have happened happened. The only regret was that she finally got drunk yesterday. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it was really a pity that he did not get any secrets from her. The inspiration for this idea came from Mississippi Lu. Last time when he was drunk, she even asked those virtuous and artistic teachers, and said that she already knew all his secrets. She did ask a lot of things, but if he said that he did not have any secrets with her, Li Yi would not believe it. Did she know that he actually came from another world? Did she know why he was always mischievous in front of her? She did not know anything. Xiao Huan walked out of the room and looked at the strange expression on the young master's face. She asked curiously, "Young master, did something happy happen to you this morning?" No. Li Yi would not admit that it was because Mississippi Lu hit his laughing acupuncture point, and he said seriously. Xiao Huan said in disbelief, "But young master smiled the whole morning." No means no. Okay. Xiao Huan did not ask about this matter and asked again, "Then where did young master sleep last night?" Last night. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "I slept with Fong." Xiao Huan looked at Fong, who came in from outside the door, and asked, "Uncle Fong, right?" Old Fong was taken aback. He looked at Li Yi, then at Xiao Huan, and nodded. "Yes, that's right." Xiao Huan looked at Fong and said, "I haven't asked Uncle what you said." "Yes." Old Fong looked left and right, then clasped his hands behind his back and walked away. "Who sent you to my side?" "Uncle Fong, he. Li Yi stared at her and said, "Who sent you to my side, Uncle Fong, he. Li Yi glared at her and said, "What's there to ask? You didn't open the door for me last night, so I had to squeeze with Fong. Otherwise, where else could I sleep with the second miss?" Li Yi looked at Mississippi Lu, who came out of the room, and asked, "Don't you think so, Rui?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him and walked straight out of the yard without saying anything. Oh. Xiao Huan nodded, looked at the yard door and asked, "But young master, why is the yard door broken?" Li knocked on her head and said, "Why do you have so many questions? Are you 100,000 wise?" He was stunned after he said it. This scene in this sentence, why did it have a sense of déjà vu? Xiao Huan covered her head and said, "Then I won't ask any more. I'll tell a joke to young master." The second miss asked me to tell more jokes to young master. Li couldn't help shivering and felt a dull pain in his stomach. He covered his ears and said, "I won't listen, I won't listen." Xiao Huan hugged his arm and said coquettishly, Young master, just listen." "I won't listen." "Then I'll tell my joke." "Young master just won't listen." The little servant girl was not obedient. If the soft approach didn't work, he had to use the hard approach. He pressed Xiao Huan on his thigh and spanked her butt. She never mentioned the joke again and ran away with a red face in her butt. Watching her run away, Li Yi sat in the courtyard and let out a long sigh. People say that a moment of the night is worth 1,000 gold, but 1,000 gold can't buy an inch of time. Time flies like an arrow, the sun and moon shuttle. It's all about the preciousness of the wedding night. 1,000 gold can't buy an inch of time. Time flies like a rice dumpling. But the first time he had the wedding night, he was dragged up the mountain by Mississippi Lu and spent it in a daze. That night, he was shocked by Rui breaking the wooden table with her palm. The second time he had the wedding night, he was rolled up like a dumpling and couldn't move. The night of the night was wasted just like that. He must have owed Mississippi Lu a lot of money in his previous life, the kind that even 2,000 gold wouldn't be enough. Rui, Ruoqing and Zumo were really too much. They didn't know when to be modest. Was the wedding night the time to be modest? Kong Rong let them be? This time, not only did he not make up for the regret of the wedding night, but he had even more regrets. Li silently swore in his heart that the next time, the time after that, it must be perfect. Thinking of the next time, the time after that, he was a little happy again, and then his stomach began to hurt again. Mississippi Lu walked in from outside and sat opposite him. When Li Yi saw her, his stomach hurt even more and he subconsciously became vigilant. He immediately said, "What are you trying to do?" Don't think that you can do whatever you want just because you're beautiful and you can go back on your word. You promised me last night. I promised you last night I won't. Mississippi Lu looked at him and said, "I won't spank your butt and I didn't break my promise." Li Yi thought about it. She didn't break her promise, but her methods were even more ruthless. You really shouldn't have said so much last night. There was a lot of meat on her butt and it was exciting to be spanked. It's over, it's over. Li Yi quickly dispelled this thought from his mind. After spending so much time with Fong, he felt that he seemed to have been infected by him and had become a masochist. Mississippi Lu thought about it, stared at him and said, "I have a question to ask you." "What question do you have again?" Li Yi looked at her and asked warily, then his expression froze. Why did he say, "Again"? Mississippi Lu rubbed the space between her eyebrows, stared at him and asked, "Other than this, did I say anything else to you last night?" "No, right?" Li actually didn't know. He really forgot. Even Rui Lu, the always drunk, had forgotten everything after getting drunk. How could she expect him to remember? Wasn't she thinking too highly of him? Mississippi Lu looked at his expression and asked again, "You really don't remember?" Li shook his head. "I don't remember. It's better to drink less in the future. It's not good for your health and it'll make things worse. Then it's okay." Mississippi Lu finally felt relieved. She waved her hand, stood up and left. She felt that he said a very rare truth. Don't be greedy when you drink because when you're drunk, you don't know what you'll say and what you'll do. She actually asked him who was prettier between her and Emingzu. She actually said, "They don't want it, but I want it." She actually asked him the biggest secret that she learned from him that night. She actually slept on the same bed with him for the whole night. Fortunately, he didn't remember any of this. Wait a minute. Li Yi suddenly stood up, and a look of realization appeared on his face. He looked at Mississippi Lu and said, I remember everything." Hearing Li Yi's voice, Mississippi Lu stopped in her tracks. Her body stiffened, and her heart began to beat wildly, uncontrollably. She turned around, looked at him and asked calmly, "What did you remember?" Her expression was indifferent, and her fists, which were hidden in her sleeves, were clenched tightly. Even she didn't realize that her voice was slightly trembling. Of course, Li Yi didn't realize that Rui's voice was trembling either. In his heart he gave him 100 thumbs up for his wit. Opportunities always came to those who were prepared. Without a doubt this was an opportunity. He looked at Mississippi Lu, thought for a moment and said solemnly, Last night, you said that you'll be gentler to me in the future. You won't speak loudly to me and you won't bully me from time to time. You also said that you'll prepare an expensive gift for me during holidays and birthdays. Also, you said that you'll be nicer to me, that you'll massage my shoulders and back when I'm tired, and cook noodles for me when I'm hungry. Chapter 1035. You have to listen to me in the future. You have to help me when Emingzu bullies me. You can't be on her side. After listening to him for a quarter of an hour, Mississippi Lou closed her eyes and let out a long sigh of relief. She asked, anything else? Of course. You said Emingzu. Mississippi Lou's eyes suddenly opened. A trace of panic flashed across her pretty face. Her heart began to beat wildly again. What happened to Emingzu? You said Emingzu was too much. How could she bully others like that? Li thought for a moment and nodded. He looked at her and said, yes, that's what you said. You said that when we return to the capital, you will personally spank her to avenge me. I promise you that. Mississippi Lou took a deep breath and crossed her arms. She looked at him and asked, anything else? Li thought for a moment and said, yes, but I can't remember it now. We'll talk about it when I remember it. You should do what you promised first. He suddenly felt some admiration for himself, so much so that he prostrated himself in admiration. Anyway, Rui was drunk last night. He didn't remember what happened. It was up to him to make up stories. If he didn't have a little conscience, he would directly tell her that she violated his body last night and ask for more compensation and privileges. Second Lady Lu did not speak. Li looked at her and suddenly asked, you are the chief of the Wulin League. Your words carry enormous weight. What you say is like spilled water. You won't go back on your word, will you? No. Mississippi Lou smiled and shook her head. She said softly, why would I? I'll keep my word. Are you hungry or tired? Let me massage your shoulders first. Do you want to cook a bowl of noodles for you first? Happiness came so suddenly that Li couldn't believe it. He suspected that he was dreaming and that he was still lying on the bed with Mississippi Lou. Let's massage the shoulders first, Li said after some thought. It wasn't until he was lying on the rocking chair with Mississippi Lou's hands roaming around his shoulders that he finally accepted reality. She actually believed it, she really believed it. Li could already imagine the beautiful life in the future. He took a deep breath and said, I didn't use enough strength, use more strength? Mississippi Lou smiled and said, okay. Outside the door, Fang saw with his own eyes that Xiao Huan went out. Only then did he come out from behind a big tree, ready to ask the son-in-law what they were talking about. As a qualified follower, he needed to have this kind of awareness. Even if the son-in-law said that he slept with him last night, he had to convince himself that he wasn't hugging two women last night. It was the son-in-law who was hugging him last night. For the son-in-law, for the young miss, for the second miss, for a perfect family. He felt that he was very great at this moment. Perhaps his back was shining with colorful light like that of Lady Ruoqing. When he walked to the door, he heard screams coming from the yard. You used too much strength. It hurts, it hurts. Be gentle, be gentle. This was the voice of the son-in-law. I haven't used any strength yet. Just bear with it a little longer. It won't hurt in a while. This was the voice of the second Mississippi. Fang stopped in his tracks and stood there for a while. Then he turned around and strode away. It's just a joke. Why are you so serious? His bones were almost broken by her. Li rubbed his shoulders and said, I forgot. Tell me, what else did you say last night? Nothing. Mississippi Lou clapped her hands and asked, do you still want to eat noodles? No. Li's attitude was very firm. He almost dismembered himself by rubbing his shoulders. If he asked her to cook another bowl of noodles, he might directly poison himself to death. It was better not to take this risk. In the end, he didn't ask what Mississippi Lou said last night. Rui, Ruoqing, and Zumo disappeared in the morning. He didn't know if it was some custom or something else. Some of the customs of these women, Li didn't know much. Fang walked in from outside and sat opposite him. Looking at him, he sighed and said, son-in-law, as a man, you have to be responsible for what you do. If you dare to do it but don't dare to take responsibility, you are not a man. Li turned to look at him and asked, responsible? What responsibility? Fang thought for a moment and said, son-in-law, if you don't want to take responsibility, you can let the second miss take responsibility. It's the same anyway. Before leaving, he patted Li Yi's shoulder and said earnestly, son-in-law, You are destined to be unable to escape the clutches of the second miss in this life. Be optimistic and accept your fate. Life is like being raped. If you can't resist, then enjoy it to the fullest. This is my shallow opinion in this life. Take your time to understand. Fang always had a deep understanding of life, but he was wrong about one thing. Life was indeed like being raped, but he didn't think of resisting. The architectural style of the Jianghu of Silla mansion was from the inside to the outside, from the master to the servant. The innermost courtyard was where the master of the mansion lived. It could be counted as Ruoqing, Zimo, and himself. Of course, there were also Xiao Huan, Xiao Zhu, and Xiao Chui's rooms. Yong Ning had the most freedom and could sleep wherever she wanted. There was also a study without a bed. Li Yi thought that he already had Rui and Zimo and Ruoqing, so there was no need to put a bed in the study. Only now did he realize how naive this thought was. If that was really the case, he wouldn't have spent the night with Mississippi Lu. Be careful, just put it in that corner. Fang moved the mattress in alone. Li Yi looked around and picked a corner that was pleasing to the eye. Fang put the bed in place and looked at Li Yi with a strange gaze. In this courtyard there were eldest Miss, second Miss, Miss Zimo, Miss Ruoqing, Xiao Huan, Xiao Chui, and Xiao Zhu, the three servant girls. Son-in-law could sleep in any of the rooms, but he actually wanted to sleep in the study. Son-in-law couldn't be unable, right? At such a young age, how could he? Li Yi looked at him and said seriously, "If you look at me like that again, I'll send you to the Wu Kingdom to gather intelligence and come back in a few years." Fang clapped his hands and turned to walk outside. When he reached the door, he poked his head in and said, "Son-in-law, remember to eat more chives and kidneys. If you really can't do it, you can also use tigers or deers or something to make wine. Get lost." Fang left. When he left, he didn't forget to close the door. Li Yi soaked his feet and took off his shoes before lying on the bed and wrapping himself in the blanket. From yesterday until now, he hadn't had a good sleep. In the morning, he was chased by Mississippi Lu for a few miles, and on the first day of his wedding, he had to be alone in his room. He didn't have the mood to complain anymore and was overcome by waves of tiredness. After sleeping for an unknown period of time, the door was suddenly pushed open and gently closed. On the bed, Li Yi's eyes suddenly opened. In the middle of the night, who came to his study? A thief? Impossible. Even if he was a grandmaster, he would not be able to sneak in here. Could it be Rui? Or a rapist? Was it Rui who came to pick up flowers? While Li Yi's mind was running wild, the figure had already reached the bed, quietly took off his shoes and climbed onto the bed. Li Yi's eyes widened. Could it be that the rapist was taking the initiative to offer himself? The moonlight shone in from the window, and Li Yi could roughly see the figure. From the shape of the chest, it was not Rui but Zimo who came to pick up flowers. Chapter 1036. She shut him out on the wedding night, and now she wanted to secretly pick flowers. Li Yi really didn't expect that Zuemo would be so interested in this. Did she really think that she could get on and off his bed as she pleased? He closed his eyes and waited for her to pick flowers. However, after waiting for a long time, the person beside the bed did not move. Just when Li Yi was about to get impatient, he felt that she stood up. Was she going to run away? Li Yi couldn't pretend anymore. He grabbed her hand and dragged her to the bed. Ah! There was a cry of surprise in the room. Li Yi hugged her tightly and said fiercely, "Since you are here, don't leave, Shu." After she reacted, she immediately looked back and whispered, "I sneaked here, they don't know." Li Yi carried her to the bed and whispered, "What are you doing here, picking flowers?" In response to him was a hot kiss. Li Yi had seen what a passionate Zuemo was like. In the dark night, there was only breathing and two gradually hot bodies. Li Yi knew what she was here to do. She was here to make up for the regret of the wedding night and carry out the last step they didn't finish yesterday. Squeak! There was a sound at the door again. Zuemo was startled and immediately lay down inside, hiding in the quilt. Li Yi looked at the figure who quietly closed the door with some surprise. He thought to himself that it couldn't be. Two flower thieves came in one night. It seemed that he should carefully consider Fang's suggestion just now. The person who sneaked in was easy to recognize. From the way she walked and the hazy figure, it was Ruoqing. When Ruoqing walked to the bed, she saw him sitting on the bed. She was shocked and said after a long time, You haven't slept yet. What do you mean by you, me?" Li Yi pulled her over and said, "Call me husband." Someone gently pinched his thigh. "Husband?" she called out softly, and Li Yi could feel that her body was getting hot. Yesterday, I didn't mean to." Ruoqing was not as passionate as Zuemo. Her voice was so soft that it was almost inaudible. She said, tonight I will come to accompany you. Don't tell Zuemo or she will laugh at me. Don't worry, I won't laugh. A familiar voice suddenly sounded. Ruoqing was startled. Seeing the figure crawling out from under the blanket, she was startled and then said in panic, Zuemo, what do you mean by you? You snuck over without telling me. Tomorrow I'll punish you according to the family rules. Ruoqing hurriedly stood up and said, I'll go first. Li grabbed her wrist and gently pulled, causing her to fall onto the bed again. Li held her slender waist and said softly, It is fate that brought us together. Why don't we stay together? He slept soundly when he had someone by his side. It was just that his arms were a little numb because they were pillowed on each side. When he came out of the study, it was already late in the morning. Fang was working in the yard, moving the stone table and stone bench to a place further away from the swing. When he saw Li, he stopped in his tracks, thought for a moment and asked, Young master, do you really not need to ask the kitchen to fry another chives? No matter whether others believed it or not, he really just hugged them to sleep last night. Nothing that should have happened did not happen, and nothing that should have happened did not happen. If it was only Zuemo or Ruoqing, the situation would naturally be different. However, the situation last night was special. The two women did not even take the first step, and the second step naturally could not be rushed. That was a matter for the future. Even though he knew that if he made some kind of request they would not refuse, for them, this was something that would be unforgettable for the rest of their lives. He should not be so hasty. However, what old Fang said made sense. After all, it was better to be on the defensive than to be on the defensive. Li thought for a moment and nodded. Let's fry one. Remember to fry them together with the kidney. In the early years of the Jinping era, the number of merchants settling in Suzhou began to increase rapidly. The flow of people in Yong County skyrocketed. The originally sparse streets gradually became lively and prosperous. This series of changes had long changed the people from the initial joy and excitement to numbness. Under the governance of His Highness Jianghu of Silla, Suzhou would only get better and better. This was something that they never doubted in their hearts. Ever since the situation in the fringe changed dramatically, the bandits were almost completely eradicated. A smooth trade route was opened up, which was known as the Great Mountain Road. The merchants of the three kingdoms also benefited greatly from this. This was a region that was not under the jurisdiction of the three kingdoms. However, the fringe also had its own rules: freedom, equality, justice, and the rule of law. The fringe, which used to make people pale at the mere mention of its name, had completely changed in just over a year's time. The public security was good, even better than that of the various prefectures. The name Fringe no longer lived up to its name. The caravans traveling on the Great Mountain Road preferred to call it New World. There were even many large caravans that had set up shops and workshops in the mountains for convenience and safety. Of course, these were built on the foundations of the original towns in the mountains. Before this, no one knew that there was such a paradise in the desolate mountains. In the Jianghu of Silla's mansion, Fang leaned on the kitchen door and said, Young master, we've almost cleared the road between the Qi kingdom and the Jing kingdom. The bandits we encountered along the way, other than those we chased away, have all been subdued. However, there are more hard to deal with near the Wu kingdom. We don't have enough manpower for the time being, so it's a little troublesome to deal with them head-on. Li was cooking fish, Drunk Mo's favorite steamed fish. When he heard that, he said casually, Let's put off the trouble for now. We'll talk about it when we can spare some manpower. Watching the young master carry the steamed fish out, Fang swallowed his saliva and shook his head. Ever since the wedding, the young master had been indulging in the land of love and tenderness all day long. He didn't even care about proper business. The spring night was short and the sun rose high in the sky. From now on, the Jianghu of Silla would never get up. After the steamed fish was done, there was only Mississippi Lou's favorite dish left. Li returned to the kitchen, wondering if he should make himself a dish of stir-fried kidney with chives later to nourish himself. He had been a little too depraved in the past 2 months. Even if it wasn't for the sake of becoming a martial arts master to avenge Mingzhu's letter, for the sake of a happy life in the future, he had to train harder and strengthen his physique. Try this, and this, he couldn't favor one and discriminate against the other. Including Mississippi Lou, he picked up a mouthful of food for everyone at the table. Only then did Li begin to eat. Li watched Drunk Mo eat a mouthful of fish, and then her expression became a little strange. He was very clear about his cooking skills. Li picked up a mouthful of fish himself. It tasted very good. He looked at Drunk Imo and asked, "What's wrong, doesn't it suit your taste?" "No," Drunk Imo said. Her face turned pale and she immediately ran away. Before Li could react, the sound of retching came from outside the door. Li looked at Rui and Rui watching and asked, "Is it that bad? I'll go out and see her." Without waiting for them to answer, he immediately ran out. Rui picked up a mouthful of fish and tasted it. A puzzled look appeared on her face. When she looked out the door, she was stunned, and then the expression on her face changed: surprise, disbelief, and a trace of resentment. Outside the door, Drunk Imo leaned against the pillar. Her face was pale and she kept retching, but she didn't vomit anything. Li hurriedly ran over, patted her back gently and said with concern, "What's wrong?" "I'll call the doctor." She shook her head and said, "It's nothing. I suddenly feel a little uncomfortable. I'll be fine after going back to my room to rest. I'll help you back first." Li helped her back to her room and let her lie on the bed. Then he asked, "Other than feeling nauseous, where else do you feel uncomfortable?" Drunk Imo said softly, "I still feel a little dizzy." "Nausea, dizziness?" Li seemed to think of something. He grabbed her hand and suddenly asked, How long has it been since you last came?" Which? Drunk Imo looked at him in confusion. After understanding, her face turned red. She glanced at him and said, "How long has it been since I last came? You still don't know." "Of course you're not scared." Drunk Ink rolled her eyes at him and leaned on his chest. The nervousness on her face faded a little. She blinked and suddenly smiled. "Do you think our child will be a boy or a girl?" Li stroked her hair and said, "If it's a boy, we'll protect you. If it's a girl, I'll protect you and your mother." Drunk Ink leaned lightly on his chest and murmured, "You won't protect me. You only know how to bully me." When Rui was pregnant, Li couldn't stay by her side from beginning to end. This had always been his regret. He couldn't make the same mistake a second time. He had already warned Wang Wei not to be impatient about the matter in the fringe. He told him to put aside the major forces that he hadn't subdued in the Wu kingdom and focus on stabilizing the rear. As for the daily affairs of Shu province with Chen Chong around, there was no need to worry. Provincial Governor Chen's ability was unquestionable. When a woman was pregnant, there would be many symptoms including dizziness, nausea, loss of appetite, and so on. In addition to physical problems, mental problems were more likely to occur. At this time, the company of the other half was especially important. Li would hug her to sleep almost every few nights. From dressing up to eating and sleeping, he wouldn't let anyone else interfere. This made Rui, who had always been gentle and generous, a little jealous. One night, after washing up, she leaned on the bed and said in a slightly sour tone, "Husband is so good to Sister Drunk Ink. I'm a little envious of her." Actually, Li had always treated them equally. It was impossible for him to treat them equally. But if he asked himself, he had never been partial to one person. Now that Drunk Ink was in a special period, there was no difference between how Li treated her and how he treated Rui at that time. He knew that Rui was just joking. He pulled her over and said, "What's there to be envious of? When my wife gets pregnant, they'll be the ones envious of you." Rui sighed and said, "How good would it be if I hadn't broken through to the Grandmaster level?" "It's okay." Li shook his head and said, "Grandmasters aren't cabbages that you can pick and choose from. At most, we'll just try a few more times." "How do we try?" Li waved his hand to turn off the light. He leaned over to her ear and whispered, "Just like this." The light in the room dimmed, and the enchanting scenery in the dark couldn't be seen. Late at night, in a few rooms in the small courtyard, Ruaching and Drunk Ink had already fallen asleep. 2 rooms away, Mississippi Lu was lying on the bed when her eyes suddenly opened. In the dark, a blush quickly appeared on her face, and she quickly covered her ears with her hands. She covered her ears and covered her head in the quilt. The suppressed and extremely low voice could no longer be heard, but she felt a little hot. She tossed and turned on the bed and couldn't fall asleep. Each room had a separate shower. After taking a shower, Li carried Rui back to the bed and suddenly thought of a problem. He looked next door, then looked at Rui and asked, "Do you think they can hear us just now?" "Don't worry." Rui shook her head and said, "The 2 younger sisters are already asleep." Li looked at her and only felt that a grandmaster was really powerful. It was simply a human-shaped eavesdropping device. He had to experience this feeling in this life, then he realized one thing. Rui seemed to be only one step away from this realm. He looked at Rui and asked, "What about Rui? Can she also hear us?" This time Rui didn't say anything. Not speaking was a tacit agreement. He thought about it and asked Rui in a low voice, "Do you think it's a little inconvenient for Rui to live here?" Rui closed her eyes and said softly, "What do you want to say? Go and talk to Rui yourself." If he went to talk to Rui he would be courting death. Lee was not that stupid. Maybe Mississippi Lou went to bed very early every night. He closed his eyes and prepared to sleep. After a while, he opened his eyes again and turned to look at Rui. He asked, "My wife can hear from so far away. Do you remember on the night of our wedding when Rui and I were drunk in her room? What did she say to me?" Anyway, they didn't do anything out of line that day. Rui knew about it. Lee also just realized that Mississippi Lou didn't tell him what happened that night, but Rui probably knew. Rui thought about it and said, "She made a promise with you that she wouldn't spank you anymore." And then? Lee was refreshed. He then asked, "I know this. What else did she say?" And then? After a while Rui said, "Then I fell asleep." What else did she say? You can only ask Rui herself. Lee felt a little regretful. If Mississippi Lou remembered it herself he wouldn't have to ask Rui. He held Rui's hand and whispered, "Let's sleep." Rui responded. After a long time she asked, "Do you know how old Rui is this year?" "Soon to be 20. Lee opened his eyes and said, "In a few years it'll be time for me to get married. I don't know which good man will get lucky." Chapter 1038. Mississippi Lou was almost 20 years old. Before Rui went to bed last night, she unintentionally asked this question. Lee then realized how fast time had passed. When she was riding on the horse and looking down at him in his eyes, she was only equivalent to a young girl in her prime in the future. Perhaps there was a little rebellion and violence in adolescence. Of course, as she gradually grew up and matured, there was only violence left now. A 20-year-old girl, whether in the Jing Kingdom, the Qi Kingdom or the Wu Kingdom, was definitely an old leftover woman. Even though the marriage law in the Jing Kingdom had been reformed a few years ago and was ahead of the other countries, it only delayed the marriageable age by a few years. According to the statistics of the Ministry of Revenue, the average age of marriage for a girl in the Jing Kingdom was 16 to 17 years old. Of course, this age could not be compared to the future, but compared to the Wu Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom, it was much more scientific. According to this data, not only Mississippi Lou, even Xiao Huan, Xiao Zhu and Xiao Chui were left behind. However, Mississippi Lou should not care about other people's opinions. After all, she was a woman who wanted to be the king of the mountain bandits. Now that this dream had not been realized as a heroine and the future king of the mountain bandits, how could she give up her dream because of a romantic relationship? However, what if Rui did not think so? What if she cared about other people's opinions? What if she felt that a man and a woman should get married when they are of age? What if she felt that a romantic relationship was the most important thing? A girl's mind was the most difficult to guess. Sometimes, Lee could not even guess what Yongning was thinking, let alone Rui. He had to find a chance to ask her, otherwise he would not be able to put his mind at ease. When a girl grew up, it was indeed worrisome. Mississippi Lou woke up late today, even later than Lee. Moreover, his complexion did not look too good. Lee sat in the courtyard and looked at her. He asked with concern, "What's wrong? Did you not sleep well last night?" Mississippi Lou glared at him and didn't say anything. She continued her morning exercise in the courtyard. The morning exercise was actually Tai Chi that Rui had modified. Rui had now reached a bottleneck in martial arts. In Su's words, diligent practice was no longer helpful for her to improve her realm. What she needed was an opportunity. Lee didn't know much about opportunities. He only knew that practicing martial arts was like rowing a boat against the current. If you didn't advance, you would fall behind. If Rui didn't advance, he would advance, which was equivalent to Rui falling behind. As long as she stood still, he would catch up to her sooner or later. At that time it was possible for him to surpass her in terms of martial arts, and then he could, an expert was indeed an expert. His morning exercise was like a dance. The whole set of movements was very pleasing to the eye. After a quarter of an hour, Rui's morning exercise was over. Li placed the heated breakfast on the table. She washed her hands and walked over. Li sat opposite her and watched her eat. Rui usually didn't take the initiative to speak, so Li Yi had to find a topic himself. Li Yi looked at her slightly haggard face and asked, "You always look pale in the morning. Is it because you're not used to living here? Do you want me to move you to another courtyard?" Mississippi Lu took a small sip of porridge and looked up at him. There was a hint of inexplicable meaning in her eyes. Li Yi couldn't help but feel a little guilty when he saw that look. Worried that she would misunderstand something, Li Yi hurriedly explained, "Of course, if you think it's okay to live here, just pretend I didn't say anything. I'm not chasing you away and I'm not saying you're unnecessary." Mississippi Lu ignored him and buried her head in her porridge. Li Yi thought for a moment and asked, "Rui, you'll be 20 in a few days, right? And then?" Miss Lu glanced at him again and said casually. It was obvious that she was waiting for his next words. "I don't mean anything else." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I just suddenly remembered that when Rui was 20, Dwainer was already born. You're not young anymore. When are you going to get married? Do you have any plans?" Guessing other people's thoughts was not a good thing. Li Yi decided to ask in a roundabout way. After getting an answer from Mississippi Lu, he felt a little more confident. Without waiting for Mississippi Lu to answer, he immediately said, "Of course, I feel that although family is important, a girl should still prioritize her career. You have Lu Meng in your hand and you're in charge of the fringe. You don't have to rush into getting married. Rui and I can support you." Mississippi Lu put down her bowl and wiped her mouth with a napkin. Then she looked straight at him. This made Li Yi feel even more guilty. After some time, Mississippi Lu suddenly retracted her gaze and said, "You're right. I'm already 20. If I don't hurry to get married, I'll be like Li Emingzu in a few years. No one wants me." Li Yi looked at her and murmured, "Emingzu, she has someone who wants her." "What?" "Nothing." Mississippi Lu shook her head and said, "I don't want to be like Li Emingzu. Moreover, I have my own hands and feet. I don't need you and my sister to support me." Then she looked at Li Yi and said, "Also, I forgot to tell you that I already have a sweetheart. He's handsome and his martial arts are not bad. He's in Lu Meng. I'll introduce him to you next time." I have a sweetheart?" Li Yi looked at her with his eyes wide open. His soul seemed to be hit by a speeding carriage. There was a slight tremble in his voice. Mississippi Lu nodded and said, "You and my sister don't need to worry. We'll get married when it's time." She stood up and said, "I still have something to do in the league. I'll leave first." Li Yi stood up and took her small bowl. He said in a daze, "Don't you want another bowl?" "No." Mississippi Lu waved her hand and said, "The porridge you cooked this time was too sweet. Remember to put less sugar next time." Then she turned around and left. Her figure disappeared out of the door. Li Yi held the empty bowl in his hand. His mind was blank. What Mississippi Lu had just said exploded in his mind like thunder. She had a sweetheart. She still wanted to get married. Did she ask for Rui's opinion? Did she ask for his opinion? Men nowadays couldn't be judged on the surface. There were a lot of sanctimonious beasts. What if she met a bad guy? She actually complained that the porridge he cooked was too sweet. She clearly liked eating sweet things. When did she stop liking sweet things? Li Yi held the empty bowl and stood there in a daze. Outside the door, Mississippi Lu looked back. She turned back and the corner of her mouth curled up into an imperceptible smile. "Second Miss, good morning." Fang walked over from the side and waved his hand to greet her. "Morning." Mississippi Lu smiled at him and turned to leave. Fang's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. The expression on his face immediately froze. He looked at the sun above his head. There was no doubt that it rose from the east. Since the sun did not rise from the west, why did Second Miss smile at him? Could it be that Second Miss also thought that the new clothes he wore today matched him very well? After a long time, he shook his head and walked into the courtyard. Seeing Li Yi standing in the courtyard, Fang walked over happily and asked, "Son-in-law, look at the clothes I'm wearing today. Don't I look very spirited?" Crush. The small bowl in Li Yi's hand fell to the ground and broke into several pieces. Fang looked at him in disbelief. Although he knew that the new clothes that Xiao Hong made for him looked very good on him, the son-in-law did not have to be so surprised, right? Li Yi picked up the broken pieces on the ground. Fang hurriedly said, "Son-in-law, these things can be done by the servants. Be careful not to cut yourself." The broken pieces in Li Yi's hand fell to the ground again. "I'll go get the medicinal wine." He looked at Li Yi's finger that was starting to bleed. He closed his mouth and turned to walk to the study. In a room in the inner courtyard, Xiao Huan changed the bed sheets on Second Miss's bed and put a new one on it. She picked up the pillow and patted it but found a thin book under the pillow. Chapter 1039. The young maidservant was curious. The second young miss used to hate studying even more than she did. In the academy, she would often make old Sir Chin so angry that he couldn't breathe for a long time. Later on, old Sir Chin simply didn't let her go. But in the past 2 years, or more accurately after the Lantern Festival 3 years ago, the second young miss seemed to be possessed. Many times she spent more time reading books than practicing martial arts. She and the second young miss learned how to read from the son-in-law. Now she could recognize quite a few words. She shook her head and put the book back, but for some reason she looked at it again. With just one look, she froze on the spot and opened her mouth in surprise. She already knew quite a few words, so she naturally knew what was written on the page. Mandarin duck handkerchief. She remembered that when she learned the words Mandarin duck, it took her a long time to remember it. She knew this book. She didn't know many books and couldn't even recite all 4 books and 5 classics, but she was very clear about the contents of this book. When the maidservants in the residence gossiped in private, they often mentioned this book. The title of the book was Mandarin Duck Handkerchief, but the contents had nothing to do with Mandarin ducks or handkerchiefs. This was a book that taught women how to pursue men. The book detailed the methods and steps for a woman to pursue her sweetheart, as well as how to test if a man liked her and if he was worthy of her liking, for example, the method of loosening the reins in order to advance. When the maidservant said these things, she didn't really understand them. Instead, she said, to make a man remember you, you must first make him feel pain. To make him remember you forever, you must make him feel pain deep in his heart. You can like a person's talent, his looks, or even his money. But if you like a person because he treats you well, then when he doesn't treat you well, you will have nothing. She understood 70 to 80% of these easy-to-understand words. This book had been banned by the government more than 10 years ago. The reason was that many people believed that this book was obscene and harmful to etiquette, so it was impossible to buy it on the market. However, many women would still keep a copy and keep it under their bed pillows. They would then pass it on to their close friends and treat the words in this book as priceless advice. It was said that the author of this book was an extraordinary woman. Because of her own experiences, she wrote this book to warn and teach all women in the world how to pursue the love of their lives and how to protect themselves. It was also said that the author of this book was a favored concubine deep in the palace. It was only because she had long seen through the love between men and women that she wrote this masterpiece. It didn't matter who the author of this book was. What mattered was Second Miss. Why did Second Miss read this kind of book? She flipped open the book and found that some notes had been made. She looked at the place where the notes were made and felt even more surprised. Who did the second miss like, and who did the second miss want to test? Li Yi's hand was only scratched by a broken piece of porcelain. The wound wasn't deep. After a simple cleaning and disinfecting, he didn't bandage it. Fang sat opposite him and looked at him with a burning gaze. He asked, "Son-in-law, do you have something on your mind?" Li Yi was silent for a moment. He looked at him and asked, "Have you been to the Lu Meng often recently?" "Quite often." Fang nodded. He was bullied by his own wife and couldn't fight back. He felt wronged and had to find a place to vent. "How is the Lu Meng recently? Did anything strange happen?" Fang thought for a moment and said, "Everything is fine. Nothing strange happened. It's just that a group of people passed the assessment some time ago. There are a few good seedlings among them. They look like humans, but I don't know if they are just embroidered pillows." Everyone whom old Fang described as a human or a dog was better looking than him. Fang actually wasn't ugly. Other than his body being a bit strong and his face being a bit naive, he was quite good looking. But that wasn't the main point. He looked at Fang and asked, "Do you feel that Rui has been acting strange recently?" Second miss. Fang thought for a moment and thought of the strange smile she had shown at the door. He nodded and said, "Yes." Li Yi was silent for a moment and said, "Come with me to the Lu Meng. The number of core disciples in the Lu Meng has just exceeded 3,000. The number of masters on the 3 lists is also increasing every month. At this rate, it won't be difficult to reach 4,000 by the end of the year." The Lu Meng was located outside the county. It occupied a large area and was equivalent to a small town. Lu Luo walked beside him and introduced the recent developments of the Lu Meng. The Lu Meng had Su in charge and many masters on the heaven list. It was a great attraction for people in the martial arts world. The disciples who had passed through many rounds of selection were the best of the best. After Lu Luo finished introducing the recent developments in the Lu Meng, he pointed to a room in front and said, "The League Master is there. I will take you there." He pointed to the room. A woman put a letter on the table and said, League Master, the situation in the Wu Kingdom is the same as before. The court and the rebel armies are still in a stalemate. There is no news of Princess Duanrong. The woman wore a tight white robe and was dressed like a man. Her hair was tied up in a bun similar to a man's. She had a valiant air about her. As the leader of the female army directly under the League Master, her strength was top and she was ranked in the top 10 of the heaven list. Although she was a woman, no one in the entire Lu Meng dared to look at her as a woman. I understand you, Mississippi Lu nodded. Suddenly her eyebrows moved. She took the initiative to hold the woman's hand and said, You have worked hard. I know that you have admired Jianghu of Silla for a long time and have wanted to meet him for a long time. Coincidentally, you have encountered a bottleneck in your martial arts. Come back with me today and meet Jianghu of Silla. At the same time, you can get some pointers from my sister. The woman looked down at their hands that were held together and her face suddenly blushed. Somewhere in the Lu Meng, Fang looked in surprise at Li Yi and asked, Son-in-law, why aren't you going to find second young mistress? Li Yi shook his head and said, I suddenly remembered that second madam's fish is still being steamed in the pot. If it is steamed for too long it will not be tender anymore. We have to go back quickly. Inside the room, the woman looked down at the hand Mississippi Lu was holding her hand. Her face was red and she said in a low voice, League Master you, I know. The woman was stunned. You know? Then she lowered her head and her face became even redder. She said in a low voice, I know that we are both women, and women should not like other women, but I know that you have long wanted to meet my sister and Jianghu of Silla. Rui was stunned. He looked at her and asked, what did you just say? Jianghu of Silla Mansion. Li was cooking in the small kitchen. Fang leaned against the door and looked at him worriedly. At a certain moment he suddenly said, Son-in-law. Li turned around and glanced at him, his face expressionless. Does it hurt? Fang asked. What hurts? Where else does it hurt, son-in-law? It hurts. Your hand doesn't hurt. Why does it hurt? Because you cut your hand just now. Fang finally understood. It was not the second young mistress who was strange, but the son-in-law. The son-in-law had been distracted for the whole day. He was cut by broken porcelain in the morning and cut his hand while cutting vegetables in the afternoon. This was something that would not happen even if he closed his eyes. What's wrong with your hand? At a certain moment, Mississippi Lu walked into the kitchen and looked at his bandaged hand. She frowned and asked. She looked up and saw that his eyes were confused and his expression was blank. Li shook his head and said, It's nothing. I accidentally cut it. Mississippi Lu took a step forward. How could you be so careless? Let me see, it's a small injury. Li took 2 steps back and asked, Is someone here? Oh, your sweetheart, sweetheart? Mississippi Lu glanced at him and a strange look flashed in her eyes again. She said, I was just joking with you this morning. How can I have a sweetheart? Joking? Li looked at her in grief and indignation. He walked to the yard and pointed at the gigolo standing in the yard. He said, I saw you holding hands today. Don't tell me that was also a joke? You misunderstood. Mississippi Lu looked at him and explained, She's a woman. Misunderstood? Woman? Li was even more indignant. Although I'm stupid, I'm not blind. Not only was he indignant, but he was also very disappointed. Did she think that he couldn't even tell the difference between a man and a woman? Was she so perfunctory now? He patted the gigolo's chest and said, You said he's a woman. Where are her breasts? Where are her breasts? The face of the gigolo, who was patted by Li, turned from red to white and then to green. Mississippi Lu did not answer him. She thought for a moment and looked at him and asked, Can you beat the 9th on the heaven list? Chapter 1040. Can you beat the 9th on the heaven leaderboard? Mississippi Lu actually asked him if he could beat the 9th on the heaven leaderboard. Other than grief and anger, Li was even more heartbroken. How could she not know what he was capable of? The top 10 of the Heaven Road list was a group of perverts that were weaker than her and Mingzhu. He did not lack experts, he did not lack great masters, he did not lack second great uncle who was even stronger than great masters. He even had a cheat that allowed him to level up in his sleep. But even so, he could not beat the 9th on the Heaven leaderboard. As early as 2 years ago, the martial arts master ranking, especially the Heaven leaderboard, had already turned into a sea of blood and corpses. With his current strength, if he was lucky, he could barely enter the top 20. Once the heaven leaderboard changed from 2 digits to 1 digit, the danger would increase exponentially. The ninth on the heaven leaderboard was an opponent that he could not fight head-on for now. When Li Yi thought of this, the sadness in his heart could no longer be described with words. Not only did she brush him off, but she also changed the topic. The method she used to change the topic was so unskillful. She really did not love him anymore. Apart from the sadness, Li Yi suddenly became vigilant. Murderous aura, there was murderous aura, strong murderous aura. He looked at the pretty boy beside him whose expression was even more sorrowful than his. He actually wanted to fight with him? Rui snatched his home and he actually wanted to fight with him? Rui looked at the pretty boy, then pointed at Li Yi and said, "This is the Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla that you always mention." The pretty boy's chest heaved a few times. His face was flushed and he calmed down a little. He gritted his teeth and said, "Nice to meet you, Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla." Li Yi glanced at him and asked, "What do you mean nice to meet you?" The pretty boy was startled and his chest began to heave again. "His name is Baisu." Mississippi Lu pointed at the pretty boy, looked at Li Yi and said calmly, "Baisu ha Baisu. Why not call him Baisha? A gigolo is a gigolo. He looks like a girl, his voice is girly, even his name is so girly." So, Li Yi was startled. He suddenly recalled something. Mississippi Lu seemed to have a subordinate named Baisu. She was the one in charge of the army of women. Before her, this position was held by Yang Liuqing. This showed how much Mississippi Lu trusted her. Li Yi looked at the pretty boy who was glaring at him. She had no beard, no Adam's apple, pierced ears, a feminine voice and a feminine face, because she was a woman. He then looked at her chest. Although it couldn't be called a chest when she stood next to Rui, it did seem to protrude a little more than his. Li Yi felt that he was really blind. Ninth on the heavenly roll. Indeed, one could not judge a book by its cover. Lu walked over quickly and grabbed his hand. She looked back at Fang and said, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and get the gauze and medicinal wine." Fang immediately reacted. This was the third time he had taken these two things today. Watching Mississippi Lu take off the gauze and open the medicinal wine, Li Yi hurriedly said, "I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself." Mississippi Lu crossed her arms in front of her chest and said, "Do it yourself. I'll see how you do it yourself." Li Yi didn't have a third hand, so he couldn't do it himself. He looked at Fang and said, "What are you waiting for? Come and help." Fang looked at Second Miss and then looked at his son-in-law. He leaned against the door frame and shook his head. "Sorry, I don't know how to do it." Li Yi looked at him and said in surprise, "You didn't return it in the morning and afternoon?" "Sorry, I forgot." Fang continued to shake his head. Rebellion, rebellion. Fang actually embarrassed him in front of Rui. He didn't let him go to the Wu Kingdom to inquire about the news. "Don't be so wishy-washy. Let me do it." Mississippi Lu glared at him, grabbed his hand and carefully washed it with the medicinal wine. Then she opened the gauze, cut a section and carefully wrapped it. It had to be said that Rui's wound looked much better than Fang's. After wrapping it up, she put the gauze and medicinal wine aside. As if remembering something, she looked at Li Yi and asked, "Do you think a woman can really like another woman? Lesbians are infinitely good but they can't give birth." "What?" Li Yi looked at the butterfly knot on his hand and felt awkward no matter how he looked at it. He said casually, "There's no law that says a woman can't like another woman. Like a man or a woman or even like a person or not, it's the freedom of others." As he spoke, a shocked expression appeared on his face. He looked at Mississippi Lu and said with difficulty, You can't be saying." Mississippi Lu looked at him and nodded solemnly, "You guessed right." Li Yi stood rooted to the ground in a daze. He was able to guard against Ming Zhu, he was able to guard against the gigolo, but he was unable to guard against another woman. No. He looked angry. He grabbed Mississippi Lu's wrist and slapped her but twice. He said, "No, I don't agree. Your sister won't agree either. Just give up. You've grown up, haven't you? What do you mean you don't like women? Don't you like women too?" Fang stood at the door and looked at the scene in the kitchen. The green bristle grass in his mouth had already fallen to the ground. The sun was not scorching today but he felt like he was blind. The son-in-law actually dared to do that to the second miss. He looked at the knife in the kitchen and was ready to grab it at any time. He was worried that the second miss would chop off the son-in-law's hand. "I'm just kidding. Don't be so serious, Mississippi." Lu shook off his hand and looked at the vegetables that had not been cut yet. She said, "Your hand is injured. Leave it to me. You go outside and wait. Damn it. What the hell?" Fang couldn't help but curse in a low voice when he saw the son-in-law walk out of the kitchen unscathed. He picked up the green bristle grass on the ground and put it next to Li Yi's mouth. He asked, "Son-in-law, tell me how you feel." "No, I don't feel anything." Li Yi's voice was a little shaky. Old Fang looked at his hands. Li Yi raised one of his palms, which were also trembling non-stop. He looked back at Mississippi Lu, who was wearing an apron and busy in the kitchen. He murmured, "What the hell?" Chapter 1041. Li Yi thought that the day of his wedding would be the pinnacle of his life. That day he spanked Mississippi Lu's but to avenge his years of humiliation. Of course, the consequences of reaching the pinnacle were painful. His stomach hurt for several days, but after the pa sound, the carefree feeling that came from the depths of his soul was something that he would never forget for the rest of his life. This was something that no matter how much money he earned or how high his title was, it could not compare to. He thought that after that day, there would no longer be a pinnacle in his life. Who would have thought that after 2 months he could easily reach the pinnacle of his life? Mississippi Lu did not beat him, nor did she scold him. She even helped him cut the vegetables and cook the rice. This was not Rui, this was Rui. After dinner he sat in the yard thinking about this problem. Mississippi Lu sat opposite him. Li could not help but shiver. He was ready to run away when she came to settle the score. Mississippi Lu looked at his fingers and asked, "What happened to you today?" Li Yi's 2 fingers were wrapped in gauze. He looked down, shook his head and said, "I was accidentally distracted at that time." "What were you thinking about?" "You were distracted when you were cutting vegetables?" Mississippi Lu looked at him. Li Yi always felt that her eyes were very aggressive, as if she could see through his mind. "Oh, well, I was thinking again. In the future when I make porridge I should put less sugar." Li Yi nodded and said so. "Why less? Didn't you say that you don't like sweets?" "Who said that I don't like sweets?" Mississippi Lu looked at him and said, "I have always liked it." Li Yi was a little happy. He knew it. He knew that Mississippi Lu still liked him and liked the sugar porridge he made. "Well, there is one more thing." Li Yi thought for a moment, then looked at her and said, "It's too hot these days. We're going to move to the mountains for a while. Do you want to come?" It was already July. From a few days ago, the weather began to be unbearably hot. Of course, with the ice house and the ice mirror, it didn't matter whether the weather was hot or not. However, Li Yi and Rui were worried that the coolness created by the ice would affect Zue Mo's body. It just so happened that Wang Wei wrote a letter saying that it was very cool in the mountains these days. Li Yi and Rui discussed it and planned to go there to avoid the heat and come out when the weather was cooler. Go, why not? There are still some disobedient people there. It's time to subdue them. He and Zue Mo would go there, and naturally Ruoqing would not be missing. Xiao Huan, Xiao Chui and Xiao Zhu would definitely follow, and Li Duan, Yong Ning and Mississippi Lu would not be left behind. So this time they should be going into the mountains to be bandits. Because Zue Mo was pregnant, he was busy all day and had no time to arrange things there. This time he could go there and deal with the rest. Looking at the back of Mississippi Lu walking back to her room, Li Yi was deep in thought. Rui changed all of a sudden. She really became gentle like never before. At this moment he actually found it a little difficult to adapt. Inexplicably he would feel an itch on his butt. Sure enough, he was infected by Fang. Inside the room, Mississippi Lu closed the door, walked to the bed and took out the book under her pillow. Looking at the book in her hand, a rare look of respect and admiration appeared on her face. This trace of respect and admiration was naturally for the owner of this book. The fringe. It was more appropriate to call the fringe a new world. The new world was naturally relative to the 3 kingdoms of Qi, Jing and Wu. A new trade route had been opened up here. Not only was it easy to travel, it was more importantly safe. In the past, the fringe had many forces and bandits. Although there were still many bandits now, they were unified by a powerful force. At least on this trade route it was absolutely safe. Commander Wang Wei, who had already fulfilled his childhood dream and had even surpassed his initial thought of making a name for himself and showing that tigress, stood on the top of the mountain. The mountain wind made his clothes flutter in the wind. He rubbed his bald head out of habit and couldn't help but feel a sense of lofty sentiments. A figure came along the mountain path and said in a low voice, "Commander, His Highness is here." Where are we now? We've reached the stockade. Bastard, why didn't you say so earlier? The commander's temperament that Wang Wei had painstakingly put on disappeared in an instant. He ran down the mountain. The reason why Li Yi chose to stay here for the summer was that after several years of construction, apart from the inconvenient transportation, this place was even more prosperous than Yong County town. Of course, for strategic reasons, to avoid the possibility of being surrounded by the army in the future, the road up the mountain could not be very convenient. Almost every mountain was easy to defend and difficult to attack, and there were also sufficient retreat routes. In terms of these, no one knew better than these bandits. The mountain was indeed much cooler than the prefecture city. The air was fresh and the scenery was beautiful. Rui and Rui had grown up in the mountains, but it was the first time that Ruoqing and Drunken Mo had seen such a city in the mountains. Li Duan and Yongning were also full of novelty. They were full of energy and did not look tired at all. Although Wang Wei looked a little fierce, his mind was rare, and he knew how to persist in doing things. He had a kind of energy that would not turn back until he hit the wall, and if he hit the wall he would continue to stride forward. Most importantly, in terms of being a bandit, he was very talented. It was said that his ancestors had bandit genes, so he managed this place in an orderly manner. He also built a prince's residence here. Although it was not as big as the Jianghu of Silla's residence in Yong County, it was still the most magnificent building here. Could be said that he was very thoughtful. When they walked on the Bluestone Street, two people came from a distance with a man in custody. Li looked at the three people passing by and asked, "This is?" After Wang Wei went forward and asked, he came back and said, "These guys, they don't use the latrine. They always like to relieve themselves at the street corner. They don't change their ways, so I have to lock them up for 3 days before letting them out." Wang Wei actually liked to relieve himself anywhere in the past. Everyone was not particular and there could be latrines everywhere in the mountains. But now that the prince was here, if these people made this place stinky, how could he, Commander Wang, put his face? Therefore a few days ago he issued a death order. In the future, everyone's 3 urgent needs must be solved in the latrine. Those who disobeyed the order would be locked up and served. Li Yi could understand his approach. Most of the people here were bandits and they were used to being careless. When they were in the mountains, they were used to relieving their physiological needs anywhere. But it was really not possible here. On such a hot day, if everyone peed outside, the smell could be imagined. But thinking about it carefully, there was still a big loophole in this solution. Li Yi thought about it and asked, "Is it useful to lock them up?" "It's useless." Wang Wei shook his head with a bitter smile and said, "These guys are used to being casual. They have always been like this. They would rather solve it outside the latrine than go in." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Since it's useless, there's no need to lock them up. If the punishment for urinating and defecating anywhere was not to work and still have food and drink, then this punishment was no different from a reward." Wang Wei was still too straightforward. If it was Fang who was the traitor, then the problem of urinating and defecating anywhere in the stronghold would have been solved long ago. Wang Wei was startled and looked troubled. "But Your Highness, we can't just ignore it." Li Yi shook his head. "Ignore it? Who said I don't want to?" Wang Wei turned his head and looked at the indifferent expression of His Highness. Suddenly he felt a chill in his heart. In the confinement room, a man was brought in. He turned his head and said with a smile, "Old Wang, remember to bring me some beef noodles from Lu Ji's for dinner. Add more beef and more noodles. Add more chopped green onions and coriander." After saying that, he lay down on a bed in the corner and stretched comfortably. He put his hands behind his head. Boss Wang was really something. He just couldn't hold it in and had to be locked up for 3 days. However, 3 days was fine. 3 days was pretty good. He didn't have to work for 3 days and he wouldn't starve. Never in his dreams would he have thought that there was such a good thing in this world. When he was released 3 days later, he would come back. As he was thinking about this, the door of the confinement room opened from the outside. A bald man stood outside and looked at him. He said, "Come out." "So soon?" He sat up from the bed with a hint of regret on his face. Could it be that Boss Wang had gone back on his word? However, the bald man didn't let him leave. Instead, he brought him to another place. Through the window, he could see more than 10 children sitting in seats with their hands behind their backs. They were swaying their heads along with an old man in front of them. He was a little confused. This was a school. He always felt that building a school in the stronghold was unnecessary. Only those with families would send their children here. Anyway, they didn't need to pay, so he just treated it as looking after the children. Why did this little bald man bring him here? to see which brat didn't study hard and beat him up. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.